whole life is about sound. It's what makes me tick as a human being. There's sound absolutely everywhere. We have to listen. That's it, really.
You sound great.
Yeah, right.
What? You telling me you weren't feeling it? You were in it.
We don't need to put them all out.
I know, but we just need to film them.
Your Your hearing is deteriorating rapidly.
We'll come back. Till then, Lou, we just keep going, okay?
No.
Lou,
No.
let's play tomorrow. Let's see what it's like, okay? I'm gonna be like a click track. You can play to me.
You have to understand, your first responsibility is to preserve the hearing you have.
I can't hear you. Do you understand me? I can't. I'm deaf. I'm deaf.
Found a place.
I think it's important that you stay here with us right now, Ruben. We're looking for a solution to this. Not this.
I need you to wait for me, okay? You're it for me, Lou. You're my heart. You're it for me, okay? You gotta wait for me. Trying to save my life.
Ruben, the world does keep moving. It can be a damn cruel place. But those moments of stillness, when this crappy, mundane world suddenly becomes radiant and magnificent, all the fear is gone. That place will never abandon you.
Hi, I'm Riz Ahmed.
Hi, my name's Darius Martyr. Our new movie, Sound of Metal, is coming to theaters November 20th.
It's a story of a punk metal drummer.
Darius Martyr and Riz Ahmed, great to see you guys. Thanks for being here. Darius, this is such a fascinating idea for a film, a heavy metal drummer who quite suddenly loses his hearing. What made you want to pursue this as a film?
Well, it actually goes back a long time. I mean, it started about 10 years ago, and I was working with a dear friend of mine on a kind of a hybrid doc with a band called Jucifer, and they're a couple that play stupid loud music, and we had this idea to kind of it formed out of a real band and a real kind of codependent relationship, and then took it I just wanted it ever since I saw that band, and I wanted to kind of explore this idea of a relationship in this context, and to tell a story of sound in 3 acts. So it really began as this real thing with a real band, and kind of went from there.
And Riz, in your performance, we as the audience really get to feel what it might be like to be going through something as frightening and traumatic as this. What was it like for you to imagine what this experience would be like for somebody?
Well, I mean, I guess I should say it's impossible for me to ever fully put myself in those shoes. But I guess you know, anytime you play a character, you try and draw on episodes in your own life where you feel like the rug's been pulled out from under you. And there was obviously, you know, a lot of kind of going within. And so there was a kind of inward journey, I think, that was new for me, really. I think as an actor, often I've been asked to kind of step into characters that I craft almost as though they're kind of masks, you know, do lots of kind of externally facing research. But I think with something like this, yes, there was a research element, but it's just such an intense experience to go through. I had to kind of like go within and, yeah, just look in some pretty dark corners. But as I said, yeah, there was a research side to it as well, and the deaf community, particularly in New York, and Jeremy Stone, my American Sign Language instructor, was really absolutely central in helping me to understand, begin to understand the experience of someone who might be losing their hearing, and welcoming me into the deaf community, because this community, is one that we don't often see. And I think something that we're really proud of in this film is presenting deafness as a culture and as a community and not as a disability. And that's certainly part of Ruben's journey.
And what really struck me about the character Ruben that Riz plays, Darius, is how quickly the hearing loss manifests itself. Is that something that often happens where it's not this gradual thing, but it's pretty sudden?
There's a precedent for it, absolutely. They actually have a name for it, which is sudden. It's there's a name, and it happens, and oftentimes. And I talked to a number of people who had this spontaneous moment of hearing loss, and they're usually musicians. It's a little bit amorphous in the movie, and there's a whole scientific background, and we could have really geeked out, and as a matter of fact in the script we do, but we leave it a little bit of a mystery as to exactly how it happened. In other words, was it this or was it that, or was it that one concert? You don't ever really know, but there is a precedent for it. It does happen.
My husband is, he's required to speak publicly.
I have received...
Perhaps he should change jobs.
And what of my husband with a king? My husband has seen everyone.
Insert them into your mouth. Enunciate.
He hasn't seen me. I can cure your husband, but I need total trust. What was your earliest memory?
I'm not here to discuss personal matters.
Well, why are you here then?
Because I bloody well stammer!
Do you know any jokes?
Timing isn't my strong suit.
Your methods were unorthodox and controversial.
Up comes your Royal Highness.
It's actually quite good fun.
Yes. Art thou afeared?
It's your peculiar.
I take that as a compliment.
War with Germany will come, and we will need a king whom we can all stand behind.
He's afraid of his own shadow.
The nation believes that when I speak, I speak for them, but I can't speak.
You could do it. You needn't be governed by fear.
It'll be like mad King George the Stammerer. Get up, you can't sit there, get up!
Why not? It's a chair.
That is St. Edward's chair.
People have carved their names on
Listen
it.
to me! Listen to me!
Why should I waste my time listening to you?
Because I have a voice!
Yes, you do.
Your greatest test is yet to come.
What's he say?
I don't know, but he seems to be saying it rather well.
Your first wartime speech.
Broadcast to the nation and the world.
This great time of crisis.
However this turns out, I don't know how to thank you.
Bertie, you're the bravest man I know.
I intend to be a very good queen, to a very great king.
Forget everything else and just say it to me.
Come on, get up.
Morning, Brian.
Stephen, are you aware that you voluntarily embarked upon a PhD in physics?
Hello.
Hello.
Science.
Arts.
I'm a cosmologist.
What's that?
I study the marriage of space and time.
The perfect couple.
One never knows from where the next great leap forward is going to come, or from whom.
What if I reverse time to see what happened at the beginning of time itself?
Wind back the clock.
Wind back the clock.
Keep going.
I don't know how.
Yet.
Keep winding.
Where to?
It's called motor neuron disease. Life expectancy is 2 years.
I want us to be together for as long as we've got.
It'll affect everything.
You don't realize what lies ahead
This is going to be a very heavy defeat.
But I love him. And he loves me. We're going to fight this illness together. Good luck.
Why?
I'm okay.
So, this black hole at the beginning of time. Brilliant. Brilliant, Stephen. Well done, Doctor.
He has pneumonia. The only way he will survive will be to give him a tracheotomy. He will never speak again.
Yes, he will.
My name is Stephen Hawking.
It's American.
Is that a problem?
It has been a great joy to watch this man defy every expectation, both scientific and personal.
There should be no boundary to human endeavor. However bad life may seem, while there is life, there is hope.
Thank you.
Sorry, did you say something?
I said, thank you.
Vous avez des références?
Certificat d'aptitude.
Expérience professionnelle avec un BTS.
En alternance à l'Institut Bayer.
2 heures que j'attends là, vas-y, non.
Selon le contrat, vous disposez également d'une dépendance.
Allez debout, Philippe.
C'est qui ce type? Autour de toi, tout le monde s'inquiète.
Bon, il est grand, il est costaud, il a 2 bras, 2 jambes, un cerveau qui fonctionne, il est en bonne santé.
C'est trop long là.
Les gars des cités, ils n'ont aucune pitié.
C'est ce que je veux. Aucune pitié.
Voilà, c'est bon comme ça?
Attends.
Vous avez fini de jouer, là?
Mais en fait, vous sentez rien du tout là.
Bon appétit.
Ça frise la paresse là, faut renvoyer un peu.
Vous n'avez pas envie de prendre le large?
Vous voulez vous barrer, c'est ça? Et on va où?
Respirez un peu.
Ouvrir les yeux.
Oh, quelle horreur.
Non. Nine. On est d'accord pour dire qu'ici je suis vos bras et vos jambes.
My room, it really makes me go oh! because it's super pink.
My name is Mac, and I am totally blind. Never seen anything, ever.
How bad are you blind?
I'm totally blind. I am as blind as a bat. When you think of colors, what do you think of?
How should I explain this? I don't know how to. I have to think. You see colors. Well, you probably know that.
I don't see colors. You see colors.
Well, yes, I do actually. I'm trying really hard. Some colors I never even seen before.
Very true.
Have you ever saw a color of a blueberry?
No, I've never seen anything ever. That's the whole point. Blue. What do you think of when you
Blue, I think of waddle.
What about you?
And my pillow.
Your pillow?
Like Steven's shirt. Well, he can't see my shirt.
But
I mean, his.
But
no, he can't see.
I can't see that. But what sound do you think when you think of blue?
And speaking of blue, your pants are blue.
Well, jeans. So what about red?
Red is like fire and madness. I think red because an explosion.
What would?
Red reminds me of blood, I guess. Paint.
Blood?
Blood.
Blood?
Oh, yeah.
Like, oh, that's, I'm sorry. Ooh, okay. What's a sound that you associate with red? What's a middle of the road color? I say like a warm color, or warm or
Orange.
cool? Orange.
Orange are fruits. My favorite color is dark orange.
Dark orange.
Because it's so dark.
Eyes closed, find the orange.
Okay, I can find it easily. Apple, strawberry.
What about green?
Well,
do you
green
imagine?
is like happy and sometimes disgusting. Oh, what's that? Ew, broccoli! Boogers.
Boogers?
If somebody like farted or something. That's what I was gonna
Green,
say.
huh?
Yeah. Green is rotten. Green makes me feel like a zombie.
Ooh, a zombie, huh?
There's none white, of course, because we can't see white. And no can black. see white. Like, we can see white. Did he say he can't see white? No, we can't see white in a rainbow.
I think brown as the color that I use for when I don't like people.
And why is brown a meat color? Is it because it reminds you of poop?
And then yellow would be like the kid who's a good kid but can never sit still. Like, oh hey, how are you doing?
Like yellow, light.
Sounds like when you like when a box is like tumbling off a hill or something.
What would you associate like Taylor Swift color?
I know. Bright, peppy, girlish pink. Nothing bad. Unicorns exploding in my mouth. Oh my god.
Unicorns exploding in your mouth. I learn something new every day.
So I'm going to break down to you my top things that annoy me as a disabled person. All right? So let me break it down to you. The topic that sparked this entire episode. Buildings that are not wheelchair accessible in 2016. I'm talking about apartment buildings, clubs, restaurants, eateries, literally everything. My brother and I were trying to find a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom apartment. We were only left with like 5 options because either the apartment building's first floor was technically the second floor because there was an underground garage, and the only way to get to the first floor of the apartments was with an elevator. Now mind you, that is accessibility, but what if a fire breaks out? How the am I supposed to leave my apartment and get to safety if a fire breaks out and the only way to get downstairs is to take an elevator? Do they not always say when there is a fire, do not use the elevator? So what am I supposed to do? Isn't that ridiculous? And what's so annoying about when you want to go to a business or an event or live in an apartment, when it's not wheelchair accessible, it sucks because it's always a reminder of my limitations. And that's the part that's like, come on, it's 2016. It can't cost that much to get a slab of cement and create a ramp. People who are disabled want to live too, and want to live as comfortably and easily as everyone else does. And don't think that just because you're an able-bodied person now that something can't happen later. So be considerate. That's all I'm saying. So the number 2 thing that annoys me as a disabled person is when, I know this probably sounds crazy, but it's true. It's true. Getting out of my own chair or a very low seat. And when I mean by low seat, I'm talking a car, a couch, a chair. Any of those things become a task. It takes effort. Let me show you what I'm talking about. have to go through every time I want to sit on my couch. For my body, whenever I'm trying to like boost myself up, it literally feels like I have an extra 50, 100,000 pounds on me that I'm trying to lift in order to just get back on my feet. And now, let's get to the final thing that annoys me as a disabled person. When I'm out in public and I'm using my push wheelchair and the only person that is with me is a male. Hey, what's up everyone? Sorry, just wanted to jump in and clarify myself a little bit. And you know it's serious when I'm in my all natural state, okay? But I have no problems being out in public using my pushchair and only being with a man. The only time it becomes annoying is when I have to use the restroom. Does that make sense? I hope it does, but if for whatever reason it doesn't, stay watching because I'm going to break it down to you and explain in detail what I mean. All right? So back to the video. I was with my ex at the time and we had gone to an event for my job. Mind you, this event was a movie screening and I knew I couldn't wait until the movie was over because there was a Q&A afterwards and the whole nine, so it would have been like an extra hour on top of the 2 hours of the movie. So I knew I had to use the restroom before the screening started. But the thing is it was just me and him. And that's the part that was making me nervous because I was like, okay, we have to do something about this. We just had to get gangster and just bombard the male's bathroom. But the thing that made us so nervous and scared was because we didn't want people to think that we was going up in there to possibly do, you know, some freaky shit, you know, because it definitely would not have been the case. Was not trying to get arrested, was not trying to be on some, you know, weird situation. We just did not want the trouble. So thank God that that didn't happen. But that's what I have to go through sometimes. In order to avoid any and all of those situations, a lot of the times I just don't drink. I can't even hydrate myself because I don't want to end up having to use the restroom and be put in those situations again. So those are my top things that annoy me as a disabled person.
A lot of you have been asking me what it's like to be disabled and to also menstruate. And I'm going to tell you right now, it absolutely sucks. There's a lot of factors as to why, but there are also some positive things that you may not have expected being disabled and menstruating. So one of the things that sucks about menstruating is the cost. For a lot of able-bodied people, menstruating costs money, because for some reason our government thinks that menstruation and having access to clean pads and tampons is a luxury, when really it's a necessity to stay healthy. But I digress. It's already expensive enough if you use disposable pads or tampons. But when you're disabled, and specifically if you're like me, if you have bladder issues and you constantly wear pads, when you start your period, you go through those pads a lot faster, which means you're spending more money than an able-bodied person on their period. I wear bladder control pads, as you may know, and I go through like 1 or 2 pads a day. But as you can expect, when I'm on my period, I go through maybe 3 or 4 pads. Since I already wear pads, I find it's a waste of money to buy specifically period pads or tampons. I don't really like tampons, and I'm not that interested in a menstrual cup. I just generally wear my bladder control pads, which are a little bit expensive, and going through them more often when I'm bleeding is stressful. And on top of that, if you have any disability or chronic illness, even if you don't wear pads constantly, being disabled is already expensive because apparently in our government, having life is a luxury. So of course they're gonna make disabled people pay so much just to like actually live and function. But I digress once again. Just if you're disabled, you're already paying a lot just to live and access necessities, that adding menstruation on top of it, you're way over budget. The second thing that's difficult with being disabled and menstruating are the period cramps, at least for me. A lot of us deal with chronic pain. I myself have a lot of chronic pain in my back, and generally I can manage it. My period cramps aren't really at the front where my uterus is, it's in my back. So it's also intensifying my back pain.
think that the period stigma exists for a number of reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it is one of the first, biological phenomenons that really distinguishes male from female, right? It is very gender specific, and as a biological phenomenon, it also marks when a body can then become pregnant as well. And so as society is creating gender roles centuries ago, or relatively recently in some cultures, I think that mark of menarche, which is the first period, suddenly became this milestone when gender roles were constructed to be when a young woman could be a wife and a mother. Period stigma has fostered menstruation to be thought of as this taboo topic. Literally, the word taboo comes from the Polynesian root tapua, which means menstruation. So that's part of it, right? Of course, period poverty exists, and we don't even know that period poverty exists because it is this taboo topic. At the same time, part of that stigma is saying menstruation is something that we hide, that we keep to ourselves, and menstrual hygiene is not a right, it is a privilege. And that idea of menstrual hygiene not being a right is at the basis of why we have such a problem with period poverty today. My passion for periods comes from a really personal place. I sort of stumbled upon this issue at a time when my family was experiencing living without a home of our own ourselves. It really just hit home for me because it was at a time I was thinking about privilege and realizing that period poverty is something I had never experienced, but that the majority of even like the social justice movement has also neglected to think about for a while. I would define period poverty as not being able to afford an access to period products due to a lack of income. And I define the menstrual movement as the fight against period poverty and period stigma, fighting for equitable access to menstrual hygiene for all. And I think that period poverty is an issue that we are not even aware of how big it is. Like, we are just starting to do the studies that we have been dying to do for years. And the first citywide study that was done last year found that 46% of low-income women in St. Louis had to choose between a meal and period products. And Period, my organization, just released the first national study on period poverty in schools in the US and found that last year, 84% of teens have either missed class or know someone who has missed class due to a lack of access to period products. So this issue is bigger than I think anyone is even imagining right now, but at the same time makes sense because I think a misconception is thinking about period poverty as a separate issue to poverty, when in reality this is a necessity, right? Menstrual hygiene is a necessity. So just as other people might not be able to fully afford necessities and food and shelter, this is also one of the things people struggle to afford. So today, 31 states in the US have a sales tax on period products, considering them luxury items, non-essential. Meanwhile, products like Rogaine, Viagra, and penile pumps are considered essential goods, necessities. And that sales tax literally exists because it acknowledges menstrual hygiene products as privileges, like literally luxury items. And that's why I think I've been so passionate about taking down the tampon tax, because the tampon tax actually doesn't affect people who aren't experiencing the most poverty, right? The tampon tax affects people who are able to afford period products but are struggling to make that purchase. Outside of our work fighting the tampon tax, we're fighting for period products for women in prison, for homeless women, for people, menstruators who can't even afford period products in the first place. And the argument there is that they shouldn't have to have period products or need to have access to period products because they're not essential goods. So the tampon tax is sort of this necessary Trojan horse that we have to fight with before we can address overall period poverty. For anyone who wants to get involved in the menstrual movement, you can go online and simply just do some searching and find what legislation is already in the works to address period poverty. And if there isn't, start looking for other examples and taking it to legislators. Here are legislators that my tax dollars pay to represent me and my other constituents. This is an issue I care about. This is an issue that my peers care about. So we're going to take this matter to our legislator. And I think that just creating that relationship and putting public pressure on them does something. And I think that we need to feel that political power in all of us.
And she said to me, all I asked my dad for my birthday is a box of tampons and a pack of smokes. You know, like really, that's what it comes down to. It's being wished for as a birthday gift. So they have some self-respect and self-dignity.
Sat down on the side of the road, panhandling, and I had a sign, and
it said spare tampon because I needed one.
People always think when you think of shelters or drop-ins, they always bring clothes, used clothes or food, but they never think about feminine products, which we need.
Sometimes I think about going into a store and just stealing like one or two, but I don't do it because my conscience will not leave me alone.
A lot of tissue. A lot of tissue. And I know some girls, or women, sorry, who would use sponges.
I had to like take toilet paper, you know, the rolls of toilet paper from different shelters, women's drop-ins, and keep them in my car.
There's so many things that go wrong. You get toxic infection, yeast infections.
Like if people don't know that it exists, how are we supposed to get the products into the shelter, into the drop-ins?
Anybody know what period poverty is?
I think it's like when people can't afford it, so they go into period poverty because they can't afford stuff to use for their period.
That's correct. That's it. Period poverty is the inability to purchase or have access to feminine hygiene products due to financial restraints. They have diaper banks throughout the city and you can get free diapers, but you couldn't get feminine hygiene products. It is not a luxury. It should be included as a medical necessity. We created the first and only feminine hygiene bank in the city of Philadelphia, serving Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. And now we're upwards to 100+ deliveries a week all over the city, just delivering these supplies so that people can have a normal way of life.
But first, there is growing attention about the cost of menstrual products and how difficult it can be for some women and girls to pay for these essential needs. Now, many school districts and universities, as well as a few cities and states, are providing free feminine products in schools for students who might need them or can't afford them. For our weekly segment, Making the Grade, special correspondent Kavitha Cardoza, with our partner, Education Week, reports on efforts to end what's been called period poverty.
Hello.
Hi. Young women all over the country report remarkably similar experiences.
Oh, everyone's like just kind of grossed out and then embarrassed to talk about it. A lot of people say that time of the month. People say Aunt Flo has come to visit. People say Shark Week.
We shouldn't be made to keep it a secret.
Jorge Iloza agrees.
Periods are a part of life, period.
He's the mayor of Providence, Rhode Island, and he's on a mission to reduce the stigma around menstruation.
We want all of us to feel comfortable saying the word period, saying the word tampons and pads, and that's a big part of what we're trying to overcome.
Were you ever awkward about using the words in public?
Probably. Like at first it didn't flow as easily. Now I wear a P for periods pin on my lapel.
You better clarify that because people will really think that.
No, it's for Providence.
Iloza says the shame surrounding menstruation has practical implications. A year ago, the city began looking into why so many of their students were chronically absent, missing 10% of the school year. Ellen Sina, the head of the city's Healthy Communities Initiative, found in many cases it was because girls were on their period.
It's affecting their attendance at school, it's affecting their participation in physical activities, and it's affecting their participation in social activities.
£1, £2.
These pupils are talking about periods.
Normally you pay about £3 or £4 for these. And if you find the scented ones are really, really expensive. Yeah.
40 girls a week at this school in Maesteg rely on donated sanitary products. Staff say they don't ask why the girls need the products for free, but they're aware that some families are unable to afford them.
Period poverty isn't something that you automatically assume with pupil deprivation or areas of deprivation. You automatically assume that there is a need for food banks, that there is a need to help people, that there's a need for people to have all sorts of services provided for them. But this wasn't one that came to mind, and it's a bit ridiculous really, because it's something that every girl goes through, every girl needs.
Pupils say the products should be accessible to everyone.
Girls, do you know how much a box of these costs? We don't choose to have periods, and they are really expensive to buy. So if you have more than one sibling, it can be really expensive for parents. If we offer some here, then they'll come to school for starters, and then they have stuff what they need, and people will always need to talk about it. Like, you can't really just go throughout your life feeling really embarrassed and disgusted about it.
The average UK woman spends around £18,000 on sanitary products in a lifetime. Tampons and pads cost around £5 a month, but if you're a mum with 2 daughters, this could rise to £15. And for a family struggling to put food on the table, this could be more than they can afford.
If you're a woman, you like your face clean. You know, you like feeling good, smelling good. Yeah, period times are not good times for us. Hi, how are you? It is very difficult to have your period and very uncomfortable. Every day I wake up and I do my daily routine because nobody wants to smell, you know? And that's kind of a big deal out here. I've been doing this for so long. I'm 27 years old. This will be my 8th winter out here straight. We had a pretty rough childhood growing up. My mom was a victim of domestic violence, and so she put us through a lot. I went into the system. She got custody of me again, and basically she was like, you know what? I don't want you in the system anymore, but you can't be here. I hadn't lived at home since I was, 10 years old, and I took care of myself. There was no keeping me home anyway, whether if she wanted to or not. There's so many kids that it's like they fall through the cracks, I guess. And that's kind of what happened with me. If you got cramps, good luck, I don't know. Maybe get a water bottle and some hot water from Starbucks or something, you can do that. Maybe steal some Motrin.
It's a little stressful, it pops up, you're running around trying to get what you need.
Every month they are placed in a crisis situation. You shouldn't have to decide between a pad and having lunch.
A big box of tampons probably runs around $10, so that could be half of what we make during the day.
I'll just go get the tampons that I need. And that'll leave me with nothing, then I can't eat. Tampons and pads are so expensive here. I mean, like, the cheapest box of tampons in this Walgreens right here is like a little over $7. it's more money than me and my boyfriend spend on a meal together. I would rather be clean than, be full.
This is not a poor issue. This is not just about getting products to those who need them, which is obviously a priority. This is really about bringing dignity to women.
I tend to flock to places like this, which is like public parks, where they have public bathrooms.
Imagine this. You're 12, maybe 13 years old, and life is good, right? I mean, sure, maybe you have a math test on Tuesday. Oh, and you're really hoping you get invited to that big pool party coming up. But for the most part, you've got it all figured out. So you're a preteen, you just go to the bathroom one day, you look down, and you realize that you're bleeding from somewhere. You're not even really sure where. You panic, dying. Yes, you definitely might be dying. So you do what any logical person would do, and you go find your mom, and she says you're not dying. She says that you just got your first period. Pause. All right. Are you guys uncomfortable yet? You're worried that I'm going to keep describing what it's like for a preteen to get their first period? Well, I'm not going to lie to you. Parts of this talk are going to be uncomfortable. Because it is awkward, right? I mean, sure, yes, periods are natural and normal and all that good stuff. But that doesn't make it any easier to talk about. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. So this isn't going to be a big periods are beautiful talk. I'll be the first one to say that more often than not, they're a considerable pain. And I would personally be a lot more comfortable in one of those cozy auditorium seats instead of being up here talking about them. So keeping all of this in mind, let's get back into that mindset of the 13-year-old who thinks they're bleeding out. Now, generally speaking, most preteens get the learning curve under control in due time. Sure, the pool party was awkward when everyone asked why you wouldn't get in the pool to swim. But if you're from a middle-class family, period care will likely become relatively uncomfortable but largely mundane. You'll buy your monthly packs of pads, tampons, or you'll invest in a menstrual cup, and you'll keep going with your life. So for the majority of us, it's definitely easier and certainly more comfortable to not talk about that time of the month. And we shouldn't have to talk about it if we don't want to, right? But if you're one of the 1 in 5 women in the United States who cannot afford menstrual hygiene products each month, talking about it is going to become a serious part of your wellness. Because when you're faced with either free bleeding or asking for an extra pad, these are those times when talking about it becomes non-negotiable. Insufficient access to period products is commonly referred to as period product insecurity, and this could be an entire talk in itself. But today, I'm going to narrow in and talk about how incarcerated women are so uniquely affected by the consequences of period product insecurity. Now, I'll start with a few critical distinctions before we really get into things. First, I want to make it unequivocally clear that not every person who experiences a period identifies as a woman. Transgender individuals experiencing periods inside men's correctional facilities are increasingly at risk of essentially every single issue I'm going to address today. But there isn't any kind of database establishing who identifies as transgender in correctional facilities, making their stories and experiences more difficult to track down. Today, I am primarily focusing on the experiences of women simply because that's the data I have access to. My second statement is more of a personal one. While I visited prisons, care deeply for people who are incarcerated, and have researched this issue with a passionate fire in my stomach, I will never be able to truly understand or speak for the people who have experienced having a period in prison firsthand. My hope is that this talk will empower those individuals to share their story in whatever platform suits their needs, and that my talk can promote practices and resources to further their fight for equity. Now, moving into some more technical distinctions. What is a period? Now, we don't need to get too scientific here, so think of it this way. The female body goes what's called a menstrual cycle, So this is a series of repeating events. The cycle is controlled by hormones with the ultimate goal of preparing the body for pregnancy. In preparation for a fertilized egg to implant itself in the uterine wall thickens. If a fertilized egg is not implanted, though, then this thickened lining begins to shed and prepare to restart that cycle. When we shed the lining, we bleed it out. The average period lasts for about 3 to 7 days, and every woman experiences this process differently. Some women bleed more than others, and in general, menstrual cycles are not like clockwork. They can be irregular, and for women with conditions such as endometriosis or other complications, the bleeding can last for weeks at a time and be accompanied by excruciating cramping. Wow, so that's a lot of blood, right? How do women manage periods then? Well, here we see tampons, pads, liners, and menstrual cups. Menstrual cups are not currently offered at any carceral facility based on my research, even though they provide a really unique and high amount of bodily autonomy. See, menstrual cups are reusable, eliminating the need to provide a constant stream of products and giving a woman security and knowing that she will always be able to handle her period comfortably. This is not the case for pads, liners, and tampons, which are all disposable, so they need to be changed out frequently in order to avoid dangerous and painful infections. Currently, only a handful of states have any kind of policy offering free menstrual supplies in their state prisons. And often these policies only include access to pads or liners, so tampons must still be purchased at commissary. We see a few things start to happen as supplies dwindle down. First, a woman running low on supplies might try to just buy more at commissary. But keep in mind some of these numbers from the Prison Policy Initiative. We know that half of all incarcerated women are actually housed in jails, not prisons. Jails are smaller facilities meant for people awaiting trial or serving out really short sentences. The short-term nature of jails means that there is often less programming, less wage-earning opportunities, and less resources in general. Now add on the fact that a majority of these women are primary caretakers for children, and we start to see how an incarcerated woman's money can be spread really thin. Often women are faced with spending half their month's wage on a box of tampons from commissary or for paying for extra time on the phone with a loved one. So let's say that she can't afford to buy more tampons, but she has a really heavy period and she's desperate for help. Well, she can try to make an appointment with a nurse, but this is often a really dehumanizing experience. Typical procedure states that a woman requesting more pads for medical reasons will be given a fresh pad to use, and then the nurse will examine the amount of blood on the pad to determine whether or not they think the woman actually needs more pads. Again, there is very little bodily autonomy involved in this process. But I'll just add, that periods don't really work like this. It's not just the same amount of blood all day, every day. The amount of blood depends on what part of the cycle you're in. So if you can't get an appointment on your heaviest day, well, they might just not believe you that you even need any more pads. No matter what, incarcerated women are at the liberty of other people making these distinctions on whether or not they need necessary health supplies. So some prisons have policies where the woman can get more pads if she personally asks a correctional officer. But this puts the woman in a really unique and vulnerable situation. We're not talking about a woman asking a correctional officer for more toothpaste here. We're talking about a woman under correctional control asking her direct supervising figure for a supply that they know she literally needs in order to avoid bleeding through her clothes and humiliating herself. In the most extreme circumstances, this power dynamic was in full display at the Alabama Women's Prison. A federal investigation at the Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women revealed that male correctional officers were withholding menstrual supplies from women in exchange for sex. Though this is an extreme example, I think it really captures the gravity of incarcerated women's vulnerability when faced with insufficient menstrual supplies. These issues are not going away, and they're not just going to get solved on their own. Women are the fastest growing prison population by far, growing by 834% over the past 40 years. So how can you, the people sitting here today or watching this on a screen, do anything about access to menstrual supplies in women's prisons? Well, essentially, it all boils down to this. Not talking about periods is not a privilege that everyone has. regardless of whether or not a carceral institution has free menstrual supplies, the women still have to ask for more supplies every time they need them. When asked about providing unlimited menstrual supplies to incarcerated women, a male state representative from Maine notoriously stated that the jail system and the prison system were never meant to be a country club.
Scotland has become the first country in the world to provide free access to sanitary products for all women. Sarah Greenodge is following the story. Sarah, new legislation received unanimous support.
Well, this is really a historic moment in Scottish Parliament, with MPs voting unanimously in favour of the Period Products Bill, becoming the first country in the world to make sanitary products available and free of charge to all women. Since 2018, these products have been available in schools in Scotland, Wales and England, but this really goes one step further, with tampons and pads now being available and free in all public buildings, bathrooms, workplaces, even museums and football stadiums. Figures show that about 140,000 young girls don't go to school at one stage or another throughout the school year due to not having access to tampons and pads because of financial constraints. The MP who has pushed this bill through Parliament, making it legislation, would also like to see more education in schools to try and remove some of the stigma. The nationwide scheme is expected to cost the Scottish Government about 18 million Australian dollars annually, and it is hoped that the rest of the UK will soon follow suit.
I don't believe that I'm a burden. I don't believe that I'm an inconvenience. Society treats disabled people as though they are less than.
Say the word. You know, I'm disabled, it's okay.
Nobody ever wants to focus on disability because they think that it's a bad thing. I don't think that it's a bad thing. My disability is called Larsen syndrome. It is a genetic joint and muscle disorder.
So I wear a tracheostomy tube, it helps me breathe, and I have it due to vocal cord paralysis.
I have cerebral palsy and I walk with a walker. If you have questions about that, happy to answer them.
Sometimes strangers will just ask questions in a way that they act like they're entitled to my life story.
Don't immediately ask what happened.
And the answer is nothing happened and nothing's wrong.
What happened implies that it is something that I became.
And it's like, I'm not interrupting your day by making these weird comments and asking questions.
What is that? Like why do you need that?
And it's not that I'm embarrassed or ashamed. I'm not. And I will talk to you about my disability. I talk about disability all the time.
I would prefer if people didn't pretend like my disability doesn't exist.
No, I have a disability and I'm okay with that. When you're using terms like differently abled, you're actually erasing the fact that disability is a part of my identity.
Oftentimes people say, oh my God, you're so inspirational, or you're so brave and courageous.
I was in a gay bar. There were two men and one of them started crying. And then he comes up to me and hugs me. And I realized he's crying at me.
Another word for it's inspiration porn. I don't really feel that brave and courageous for just going about my day with my disability.
If this video turns into an inspiring video, I'm literally going to start some problems. Thank you.
Don't make assumptions about what I can and can't do.
It is assumed that we are not in control of our bodies, and that's just complete bullshit.
People often try to help me without asking first.
The correct way to ask if somebody would like help is to say, would you like some help? The next step is to say, what is the best way to help you?
For example, if I'm putting my coat on in public, I have a certain way of putting my coat on, and then someone will come up, grab the coat while I'm in the middle of putting it on, and say, oh, let me help you with that. And I said, how about you say, can I help you with that?
Ask, 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 and don't assume that you know. There are lots of questions about what you can and can't do in the bedroom. There are just kind ways to frame those questions. Basically saying can you get hard? That's not gonna make me want you, unless you're really hot, and then I'll find a way to
just more people need to look at themselves and be like, why is it that I'm writing off this person just because of their disability.
Is my being in a wheelchair really going to make me so different than any of the other people that you go on a date with? Give it a shot.
This is maybe new territory for you. You may never have gone out on a date with a disabled person. You may never even consider that you might want to go on a date with a disabled person. You should consider that. We're hot and we're sexy and we're really nice people. We're good people.
They are schizophrenic.
Tried to kill myself about 17 times.
Paranoid.
This is a plot by the government.
And psychotic.
Thorazine me out, leave me for lost.
But they are not in mental hospitals. They are in prison.
Prisons have become the new asylums, the new state mental hospital facilities.
Tonight, Frontline takes an unprecedented journey inside one of America's largest prison systems.
Once they get out of control, you do have to use force on them.
And investigates the stark reality of locking thousands of the mentally ill behind bars.
The attitude has been, you lock people away, then they're no longer a problem.
Prison is simply not the place to provide mental health care.
Why have America's prisons become the new asylums? As the nation's psychiatric hospitals shut down, police departments everywhere were left to handle the growing number of mentally ill on the streets.
Watch your head. Coming up here and say, open the door. I can't let you in. You guys are going to kill me and all that. She thought we was going to kill her. What's your name, sir?
Why'd she think that?
Didn't you know she's crazy?
Husband was telling her she just off her meds. So you guys just going to do a voluntary thing tonight?
Yeah, she's set to go. She wants to go.
Once you had hundreds of thousands of people leaving the mental hospitals, they suddenly, obviously, didn't become mentally healthy. They went to the streets, they became homeless, and then they eventually began to cycle into the system that cannot say no.
Have you ever considered or attempted suicide? No. Do you plan to harm yourself now or while you're incarcerated?
Well, most of them are nonviolent crimes. They're crimes against property, the petty theft out of the local 7-Eleven store, or even a criminal trespass. A person with a mental issue goes in there to try and get shelter from the elements outside, and they start acting up. And the property owner, calls the police, and then as soon as the police step in, they end up bringing them to jail, and here we go.
Today, there are nearly 500,000 mentally ill being held in jails and prisons throughout America. That's 10 times the 50,000 that remain in psychiatric hospitals.
I want to see the doctor to get my mask. Get out of my face, you filthy bitch.
This massive incarceration of inmates with severe mental illness has created enormous problems for prisons across the country.
There was a failure in society. There was no safety net for all of these persons who were no longer being treated by mental health agencies, and as a result, many of those persons who would have been in state hospitals are now in state prisons. So in addition to being the director of the Department of Corrections, I became a de facto director of a major mental health system.
Ohio corrections officials agreed to give Frontline unprecedented access to their prison system to see firsthand the difficulties of coping with the thousands of mentally ill inmates in their custody.
Just feel like I'm suffering, man. I feel like I'm suffering every day. I just feel like I'm suffering. I feel like I'm just in a real small locked room. And no matter how much I kick on the door, no matter how much I scream, man, don't nobody hear me, man.
What about you, Mr. Simmons?
They say I'm paranoid schizophrenic.
Are you on forced medication?
Yeah.
What medications are you on?
This is group therapy at the maximum security prison in Lucasville, Ohio.
Didn't like a lot of things I've seen in my childhood, a lot of things I've seen in my household. Start having hate inside of me.
Come here, man. Let me see your arms. Bring them here. I haven't got to see them. What's new? All these? These?
Yeah.
What this? This new?
Yeah.
What drove you to this point, man? Last time I seen you was doing good.
The bottom dropped out. And I just couldn't think of nothing else.
16% of our prison population in the state of Ohio, which reflects basically a national average, are persons who've been diagnosed with a mental illness, which means that they require an awful lot of attention. Many of them require hospitalization. They require major regimens of psychiatric medications. And they are a population that would be at risk not only in the institutions, but when they leave the confines of our correctional facilities.
If an inmate spits or refuses to hand back his food tray or curses an officer or doesn't cuff up when the officer says, put your hands out, cuff up, if that person was in a hospital setting, that would be considered acting out or symptomatic of the illness. In a prison system, that's considered, I'm telling you to cuff up or I'm going to write you up. They write them up. They go before a tribunal, a disciplinary tribunal. They're found guilty, and they're sent to segregation. Probably the worst thing that could happen to them and to the system, but that's what happens. That's what happens.
Being locked up in prison, it does affect your mental well-being. It's just like these environmental factors, which I continually say must be considered before one is given some diagnosis, some misdiagnosis, or some drug that's supposed to be a cure-all. I'm saying, let's find out what's really going on for us. And being in prison, that's one problem.
Well, what's all this for? Like I said, no use of force is necessary.
Convicted initially for burglary, Carl McEachran returned to prison in 1988 when he violated his parole by stealing a bicycle. For nearly a decade, McEachran's disciplinary problems led him to spiral down through the Ohio prison system, from medium security to maximum security, and eventually to the supermax.
Being involved in a solitary situation, being placed in a solitary situation, is like being placed in a prison's prison. And that's worse than simply being taken from society and placed in prison.
If you're mentally ill when you go into segregation, you're going to become worse, invariably. If you're not mentally ill, the risk of becoming mentally ill is very high from isolation. Some people dispute that, but in my experience, the people who are so unsocialized and so psychologically fragile to begin with are deprived of any kind of social support, any kind of psychological stimulus, and they just fall apart.
McEachran spent years in solitary confinement, and eventually his psychological problems became obvious. He didn't speak for nearly a year. He began crawling down the cell block on his hands and knees. He told officers that there were cameras in his eyes.
It seemed like a hopeless situation because I was just going down. It's for falling into this abyss, or how would you pronounce it? Abyss. Abyss. Okay, and it's like you're that's it. It's like, is everybody there? You say, help, you know what I'm saying? And it's really, there's hopeless.
Carl McEachran has been in prison for over 16 years. Because of his disciplinary problems, he never became eligible for parole and has been held 13 years beyond the sentencing guidelines for his crime. Today, there are over 2 million people in U.S. jails and prisons, and nearly 500,000 of them are mentally ill. Although Ohio's prison mental health care system is considered one of the best, in much of the country, vast numbers of mentally ill inmates continue to receive little or no treatment.
I started in this work in 1973. We had 7,000 prisoners. Today we have over 44,000, And nationally, those numbers parallel what we experienced here in Ohio. But also in 1973, the number of persons in mental health and retardation facilities was a lot greater than what existed in state and federal correctional institutions.
Prison is simply not the place of first choice in which to provide mental health care. And with a certain irony, I would say we shouldn't devote ourselves to continually raising the level of mental health care in prisons, because the better you make an institution that shouldn't be used for the purpose you're improving, the more you're ensuring its use.
Are you in the community service project? See, if you get in the community service project, he can hook you up with a lot more stuff.
We are the gatekeepers of a lot of persons who are mentally ill, and that's not something we relish. We don't like that idea. We don't like the idea that we're being charged with fixing a lot of the woes of our communities. But I don't think that we've developed a system of alternatives that need to be in place in order to prevent the kind of problems that we're dealing with now in prisons and jails across this country.
Less than a month after being released from prison, Keith Williams stopped taking his medication and assaulted a counselor at the homeless shelter. He has been back to jail twice. Jerry Tharp was out of prison for only 2 months when he robbed a pharmacy. Arrested hours later, Tharp told police he committed the crime because he wanted to go back to prison. Carl McEachran, in prison for 16 years, was finally paroled. But before he could be freed, McEachran, who had come to the U.S. from Jamaica as a child, was detained by U.S. immigration and deported.
When most people think of civil rights movements in the United States, they think of the civil rights movement and the fight for women's suffrage, feminism, and probably also the LGBT movement. However, very few immediately think of or even know about the disability rights movement and how it still persists today. Despite being the largest minority group in the United States and making up 20% of the US population, people rarely think of disabled people when they think of persecuted minorities, or even when they think of minority groups at all. So, let's quickly go over the disability rights movement and then finish on why it's relevant today. Firstly, we have to understand the models of disability, mainly the moral, medical, and social models. A model of disability is a societal understanding of what disability is and how society should respond to disabled people. Each model of disability is still around somewhat today, but they are largely tied to specific time periods, which provides a nice way of framing the disability rights movement throughout modern history. Let's go over the models first. The moral model of disability frames that disabled people are an act of God. For an example, the moral model of disability is seen traditionally in very religious households, believing that the disability is either the result of sin on the parent's part, and thus should be shunned, or as a trial that God is placing on the disabled person or their family, and thus should be cared for in order to receive blessings. The medical model of disability frames disabled people as victims of circumstance, to be pitied, treated, and cured. Given that largely disability today is seen through the lens of the medical model, we can look for examples in the common Search for a Cure marathons and charities set up to treat and develop a cure for a certain disability. The social model of disability frames disability as a problem of society and pushes to change society for the betterment of disabled people. The social model is beginning to gain hold in the US and is traditionally associated with disabled activists. For an example of the social model in action, think of disabled people that use wheelchairs. The social model would say that a person needing a wheelchair doesn't make someone disabled unless society is built in such a way that the person with a wheelchair is inhibited. Shaping society where a person in a wheelchair can easily access every location a person without one can, thus eliminates the disabling factors of the disability. Think of the models of disability like this. The moral model at its best seeks to pity and care for the disabled person as a community. The medical model at its best seeks to treat and cure all disability, and the social model at its best seeks to change society to create equal access for the full participation of disabled people. We need to understand the models of disability because they give us a nice framework of how society's view of disability has changed over the past 250 years. Let's start with the moral model in U.S. history. I'm going full U.S.-centric partly because the disability rights movement itself is deeply tied to U.S. history, and also because going into the disability rights movement throughout the world would make this thing far too long. Let's first start with Dorothy Dix, an early disabled activist. In the 1840s, she set out to conduct statewide investigations of care for mentally disabled people. She saw how mistreated the mentally disabled were in hospitals and how even local communities that had designated individuals to care for mentally disabled people could not uphold their duties. After publishing a report condemning treatment of disabled people in Massachusetts, her lobbying resulted in statewide action. Although she, and others like her, truly did care about disabled people, her action manifested itself in legislation into the creation of the first residential institutions for people with disabilities in the U.S. At first, these institutions were set up to house disabled people who were homeless, charged with crimes, or needed care that their families or communities couldn't provide. Unfortunately, due to underfunding and lack of oversight, these institutions quickly became breeding grounds for abusive disabled people and a way for society to lock disabled people out of the public eye. Additional efforts to keep disabled people out of the public were the so-called ugly laws, which prohibited anyone unsightly or physically disabled from appearing in public or working a job, unless the job displayed their disability for profit. This led to an increase in the amount of not only mentally but physically disabled people institutionalized, and the ugly laws pushed disabled people towards the only work they had available, the circus or the freak show. While institutionalization was occurring from the 1840s to the 1980s, there was a growing movement focusing on science, shifting the U.S. from the moral model to the medical model. This was called the eugenics movement. You might have noticed somewhere that this seems nothing like the moral model, which it isn't exactly. Originally, institutionalization, as awful as it was a way for communities and families to care for the disabled people, but as time went on and society shifted, the moral model lost its grasp and the medical model took hold. Instead of caring for disabled people being the justification for institutionalization, the eugenics movement shifted the justification to science says we need to advance the human race, and allowing disabled people to breed will degenerate the human gene pool. Starting in the 1880s, the eugenics movement had nowhere close to the amount of stigma it has today. Claiming that it based itself in science, the eugenics movement was just what society needed to fully shift to the medical model. But wait, the medical model seeks to treat and cure disability. How is the eugenics movement like that? Well, eugenics wasn't just killing disabled people at first. At the beginning, in the late 1800s, the push was for as many people as possible to be institutionalized so that they are kept off the streets from spreading their genes with one another. Once the technology was available, forced sterilization occurred in the 1920s. Eventually, forced lobotomization was enacted, and the eugenics movement reached its peak in the 1940s when it was taken to its natural end by Nazi Germany. Okay, but what does this have to do with disability rights? Well, this is setting the stage. Firstly, showing that disabled people were absolutely an incredibly marginalized community, and secondly, that almost every institution in the world was attempting to, at best, lock them away, and at worst, kill them. Never did disabled people have the chance to speak for themselves on the world stage until the late 1900s. This leads us right to the beginning of the disability rights movement in the 1950s. As the civil rights movement was occurring across America, changes started being enacted federally and locally in the direction of disability rights, and with the inspiration from the civil rights movement and changes in their favor, disabled people embraced the social model to push for change. Social Security was amended to care for workers who were disabled and aid permanently disabled people. Some cities enacted programs to provide at-home attendant care. Deinstitutionalization slowly began from activists exposing the abusive conditions at the facilities, and research centers to aid developmentally disabled people were funded federally in the 1950s. These slow chips away at the system paved the way for activists to enter from all walks of life. Ed Roberts successfully sued UC Berkeley to become the first student with severe disabilities to attend the school in 1962. Ed Roberts went on to lead a number of efforts, the most impactful of which being his founding of the Center for Independent Living in 1972, which created the independent living movement. This movement fought for deinstitutionalization and reforms to the way society views disability, seeking to allow disabled people to lead their own lives independently. Roberts was appointed director of the California Department of Vocational Rehabilitation in 1976, an agency that had previously labeled him too disabled to work. After leaving in 1983, Roberts returned to Berkeley to form the World Institute on Disability with Judy Heumann and Joan Leon. Remember Judy for later. Let's go back to the 60s again. In 1965, Medicare and Medicaid were established, changing the care of disabled people from just those permanently disabled to those disabled for a period of longer than 12 months. Voting protections for disabled people were passed, and many states had started passing bills to fund research facilities for disabled people. By the 1970s, lobotomy had been banned in several states, the Fair Labor Standards Act was amended to allow people with disabilities into sheltered workshops, demonstrations were held to protest Nixon's vetoing of the Rehabilitation Act, several states ended their sterilization program, and sweeping laws that would change the landscape of disability in America were passed. The first of these was the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Though Nixon had vetoed the bill previously, he did eventually sign it a year later. The bill would bar employment discrimination from the federal government, prohibit discrimination from any program receiving federal funding, and redefined what a handicapped individual was, changing it from, quote, a physical or mental disability which results in a substantial handicap to employment and can reasonably be expected to benefit in terms of employability from vocational rehabilitation services, to, quote, a physical or mental impairment which substantially limits one or more of such persons' major life activities, has a record of such impairment, or is regarded as having such an impairment. This might sound like a small change, but it shaped the way disability was seen from the government forever. A, quote, substantial handicap to employment is vague and narrow in terms of defining a disability, whereas, quote, limits to one major life activity or is regarded as having such an impairment is extremely broad, and thus protects even disabled people that do not consider themselves as having a disability. This road wasn't easy, however. To get the Rehabilitation Act passed, disabled activists led by Judy Heumann, remember her, protested the veto by stopping traffic on Madison Avenue in New York City, flooding letters and protest calls, and marching in protest. They called and mailed their representatives and made their voices heard, and the bill was passed. But that was the least of their worries. Once it was passed in 1973, Section 504 of the Act, the section that actually defined disability and placed regulations, needed to be signed by the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, or Secretary of HEW. These regulations were not signed until 1977. After Nixon signed the act, and Gerald Ford's Secretary of HEW didn't sign the regulations, and then Carter's Secretary of HEW was delaying the signing, enough was enough, and disabled activists engaged in national protest now known as the 504 sit-in. Led by Judy Heumann and Frank Bowe, sit-ins by disabled protesters occurred at the HEW buildings in Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, Denver, Los Angeles, New York City, Philadelphia, Seattle, Washington, D.C., and the most noteworthy in San Francisco. At the San Francisco sit-in, Judy Heumann and 150 other disability activists engaged in the longest sit-in at a federal building to date. For 25 days, they occupied the building until Joseph Califano, President Carter's Secretary of HEW, signed the regulations. Though it took more than 5 years, they had their voices heard and achieved a major victory for disability rights. The disability rights movement wasn't over yet. There was still a lot to do. Still in the 1970s, protesting led to the final ugly law being repealed. Independent living centers were established in many cities, the first demonstrations for wheelchair-accessible public transportation occurred, compulsory sterilization was all but finished, though sterilization itself was not gone yet, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of a number of disability rights cases. On to the 80s, rules against sterilization started passing, the Americans Disabled for Accessible Public Transit, ADAPT, was founded, the Mental Illness Bill of Rights Act required states to provide protection for people with psychological disabilities, widespread ADAPT protests saw legislation in the direction of accessibility in public transport, and in 1989, the original version of the Americans with Disabilities Act was introduced. This leads us up right to 1990, where the redrafted Americans with Disabilities Act was passed and signed by President George W. Bush. I've mentioned a lot of things that have happened, but I haven't really touched on how they happened. With the ADA being redrafted, discussed, and talked about, but not passed, disabled activists realized that they could have another Section 504 on their hands. Not wanting to wait 5 years, they protested in an extravagant fashion. Organizing marches and demonstrations in D.C. and a number of other cities, the disabled activists realized they needed an attention getter, one that would get news stations to cover their movement. Their idea is what is now known as the Capitol Crawl, or, quote, the single most important catalyst for the passage of the ADA. Leaving behind their walkers, wheelchairs, crutches, and other mobility assistance devices, the disabled activists crawled up the 83 steps that lead to the Capitol. Children and the elderly alike participated in the crawl, while reporters captured their struggle to make their way up the steps that thousands do every day with ease. This demonstration came alongside protests involving thousands of people, and the ADA was passed. One more quick thing I should mention here is that the passage of the ADA was not a partisan issue. The legislation was supported by Democrats and Republicans alike, and was supported and signed into law by Republican President George W. Bush. Where was the pushback from? Religious groups and large business interests opposed the legislation for fear that installing accommodations would be too costly and could harm churches or business. Despite this, the ADA passed 76-8 in the Senate and passed unanimously in the House. How did a few thousand disability activists with little monetary lobbying power manage to convince legislators to vote in their favor? Part of this is the fact that disabled people are the largest minority group, and there were many senators and representatives that knew or had loved ones that were disabled. Famously, Ted Kennedy spoke of his sister's condition and his son's lost leg on the Senate floor. However, sympathetic senators can't be the only reason for the disability rights movement's success. Certainly the 504 sit-in changed history by sparking Califano to sign the regulations, and certainly the Capitol crawl and the numerous protests sparked the passage of the ADA. So, disabled activists didn't quite have money on their side, but they did have activism and persistence. So now the question remains, why is this important today? In case you haven't noticed, the Trump administration has sparked a new wave of the disability rights movement. Attempting to cut Medicare and the ACA, as well as attempting to provide protections to businesses over workers, threatens the rights disabled people fought for and gained over 30 years ago. Why is it that the Rehabilitation Act, Section 504, and even the ADA were passed with both Democratic and Republican support, yet now these rights are threatened? Unfortunately, just like it took activism to gain the rights, it takes consistent activism to maintain them. Going into all the reasons behind the various shifts the US has had since 1990 would make this thing too long, but there is one thing to be certain of. No rights are ever safe. The civil rights movement did not end with the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1968. It still lives on today in the fight against police brutality and discrimination. The feminist movement didn't end with women achieving the right to vote, nor will it with women achieving fully equal workplaces. The disability rights movement did not end with the ADA in 1990, though, unfortunately, many of the activists stopped fighting. The social model of disability is still not the most pervasive model seen today, but it does provide us a good framework to work from. No fight for civil rights is ever over. Just as rights can be gained, they can be lost. Never stop fighting, even when the law has been amended. Activism does not stop with a changed law, it stops with a changed public, when the activism is so ingrained in each and every person that it is no longer needed.
Madison Heights, Virginia, September 10th, 1924. Eugenics doctor Albert Sidney Priddy, the dude in charge of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, requests to sterilize 18-year-old patient Carrie Buck. According to Dr. Priddy, Buck had the mental age of a 9-year-old and argued that if she was allowed to have children, this would be dangerous for society. So, just so we are clear here, he wanted to force her to go through a procedure so that she could never have kids because of her genetics. Wait, hold up. Let's go back a bit because this story is even more messed up than this. So, Carrie Buck was the daughter of Emma Buck, who previously was taken away by the state from Carrie and her siblings when Carrie was a kid. Virginia confined Emma to, you guessed it, the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded for prostitution, immorality, and having syphilis. So, Carrie grew up with foster parents who treated her like a slave. How did Carrie also end up at the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded? Her foster parents sent her there for hopelessly bad behavior, sleeping around, and, quote, feeble-mindedness. I'm not joking. Also, they sent her there apparently as a result of being raped by her foster mother's nephew. Again, I am not joking. Since Carrie Buck was declared mentally incompetent to raise her child, her now former foster parents ended up adopting the baby. At 7 months old, that baby, whose name was Vivian, would also be declared, quote, feeble-minded. So anyway, back to Dr. Priddy trying to sterilize Carrie. He first wanted to make sure it was legal. I mean, the state had passed a law called the Virginia Sterilization Act of 1924, which allowed doctors to forcibly sterilize patients who supposedly had genetic traits that would be damaging to society if passed on to the next generation. However, the law had yet to be tested in the courts. So the board of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded got it to happen. After ordering Buck sterilized, the board appointed her a random dude named Robert Shelton to be her guardian. He was the guardian of several of the institution's patients and got paid for doing it, by the way. Buck's lawyer was a dude named Irving Whitehead, who was a eugenics fan who wanted the sterilization law. Oh, and apparently he was also on the board, helping request Buck's sterilization. In fact, fact, he was good friends with Albert Priddy and Aubrey Strode, who represented Priddy in court. There's no conflict of interest there. Whitehead made no effort to challenge the accusations that Buck was feeble-minded, of course. Shelton appealed the sterilization to the Circuit Court of Amherst County, who agreed the sterilization should take place. Shelton appealed again to the Supreme Court of Virginia, who also agreed it should take place. So one more appeal to the Supreme Court, who heard oral arguments on April 22nd, 1927. By this time, Priddy had died, and his successor, Dr. John Bell, now represented the Virginia State Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. Buck's defense argued that she had the right to have kids because it was her right to due process of the law, and that the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment also protected that right. The court didn't take too long for this one. On May 2nd, 1927, it announced its decision. It sided with Bell, saying the Virginia Sterilization Act was constitutional. It was 8-1. The lone dissenter was Justice Pierce Butler, who did not write an opinion, but him being a devout Catholic may have played a role. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote the opinion, saying, yes, Buck, as well as her mother and daughter, were indeed, quote, feeble-minded and, quote, promiscuous, and it was in Virginia's interest to get her sterilized. So basically, public welfare was more important than the welfare of one person's body, a classic greater good argument, comparing sterilization to forced vaccinations. In fact, Holmes referenced the case Jacobson v. Massachusetts, a 1904 Supreme Court decision which upheld a Massachusetts law forcing kids going to school to get the smallpox vaccine. He wrote, quote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind," unquote. Holmes now infamously concluded by writing that, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, unquote. Wow, Wendell. Just wow, buddy. Buck v. Bell further legitimized eugenics laws throughout the United States, and several states added sterilization laws afterward. In fact, 30 states had some sort of sterilization law, and ultimately around 65,000 Americans were forced to be sterilized, most of them from poor or working class backgrounds, and many sterilized without even knowing it. At the Nuremberg trials after World War II, Nazi doctors specifically cited Holmes' opinion in the decision to defend themselves. It certainly remains one of the most hated Supreme Court decisions ever. Buck v. Bell was never overturned. Believe it or not, it still stands, although it was later weakened by the Supreme Court case Skinner v. Oklahoma. Fast forward 75 years, and Virginia Governor Mark Warner apologized for his state's participation in eugenics, and later some called for reparations to all the sterilization victims. So whatever happened to Carrie Buck? Well, on October 19th, 1927, a few months after the Supreme Court decision, Dr. John Bell personally performed the operation that prevented her from ever having children again. She was the very first person in Virginia sterilized under the new law. In order to make sure the entire family couldn't reproduce, Carrie's sister, Doris, was also later sterilized after she was hospitalized for appendicitis. Yeah, she was never told about the sterilization. Doris and her husband attempted for years to have children. Only in 1980 did she find out why they were unsuccessful. Carrie's supposedly feeble-minded daughter, Vivian, later did well in school, even making the honor roll. However, she unfortunately died from an infection when she was 8 years old. As it turns out, there was no evidence whatsoever that Carrie Buck was, quote, feeble-minded. Most accounts later describe her as having average intelligence. People who knew her recalled how nice she was to everyone and how much she enjoyed reading books. She lived a long life. She died in 1983 and was buried in Charlottesville, near her only child, Vivian.
It's true, there are
Go ahead, Professor.
More than 30 states who had laws like this and did sterilize people, and only 7 of them have stepped up and even recognized that they did it, made some kind of apology, or at least said that what they did was wrong.
All right, Professor Selden, let's try and understand how this became so widespread as a policy. And I guess we have to then go to the late 19th century with the emerging, quote, science of eugenics, and then the early 20th century with the emerging science of genetics through Gregor Mendel. How does all this fuse to reach what we see in North Carolina?
So in the 18th century, Mendel's work on peas becomes known at 1900. Right. In the late 19th century in England, the eugenics movement begins. And it moves across the ocean to the United States, where it was positive in England, marrying best with best. In the U.S., we have positive and negative eugenics, marry best with best, and keep those who are judged to be inferior from reproducing. By the early 20th century, the American eugenics movement begins to operate, and it popularizes eugenics nationally in fairs, for ministers who give speeches on it.
So what are the intellectual justifications then for taking something, science that was basically about plants, frankly, and then sort of transposing that to humans then?
The proposition was that all human traits were much like the traits of peas, and so you simply had to remove those that were inferior. The science of that particular science was wrong, and by the early part of the 20th century, likely before the first decade, biologists knew it was wrong, but they didn't associate themselves with the eugenicists. So you had a separation between those who supported eugenics and the biologists who saw the eugenicists as not scientists at all.
And this really did catch on. I mean, it became enormously influential, almost part of what was the accepted scientific norm on American campuses, perhaps, and just a fact of life that this is what you could do.
Yes, there were college courses on eugenics, and in the American high school textbooks of the period, eugenics was thought to be a legitimate science.
And was it always then imbued with racism?
Biological determinism, which is the argument that's being made here, we are determined by our biology, is the basis for racism. So races are different biologically, and therefore we can make judgments about those who are superior and inferior.
As it became then the norm, then the intellectual norm, it also received a great deal of funding from the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Harrimans and these major families in the U.S. What were they? I mean, Professor Lombardo, I mean, they were funding these handsomely funded institutes then around the U.S. who were collecting records, genetic records on people and so forth. What were those records being collected for, with a view to doing what exactly?
Well, the desire of the funding sources was for people to be able to understand how heredity worked. Heredity then, as now, is something that people get very excited about. If the idea that was accepted in an era when most people in America lived on farms was that like produces like, if you have a prize steer and a prize bull, you put them together and you get prize calves. This idea was generally accepted, and the people who were putting the funding forth felt like studying how this concept worked in human beings was a good idea. To be able to understand how we could breed for the best was something they thought was worth putting their money into.
How did it make the leap then, Professor, from academia and the wealthy classes into the legislative framework of America? In 1907 already then you have Indiana putting in legislation based on eugenics. How does that shift take place?
The earliest proposals are actually in the North. Michigan in the 1890s proposes a law to sterilize criminals. It doesn't pass. Pennsylvania actually passes a law in 1905, but it's vetoed by the governor. States like New York and Massachusetts also had laws that were eventually passed, and they did some sterilization in those places. But the focal point tended to be institutions, places that people spent money to build, places that were relatively new in the 19th century, but by the early 20th century were becoming full of people who were in need of social services. Maybe criminals, maybe people in mental hospitals, maybe children in places called homes for the feeble-minded or the epileptic. Those are expensive places, and both the people who worked there, the doctors, as well as legislators, were looking for a solution to not let them grow any bigger than they were. So passing a law that would prevent people from having more children was one way.
Professor Selden, I mean, we can't ignore, though, the racial undertones of all this. So there is this prejudice then against those who are, quote, impaired in some way. But then what about the racial motivation behind all this?
From early on, eugenicists would look at Eastern and Southern Europeans coming into the United States and look at them as scants. And so there was always a sense that the other, in this case, those that weren't like the dominant group in society, were somehow a threat. And the threats were thought to be both external and internal. External from those immigrants who would come and bring their bad heredity, if you will, and internal threats as well, which leads us, I think, to a degree to North Carolina, where the threats are from indigenous populations, if you will.
And John Rayleigh, then, North Carolina, the example we had of Elaine Riddick, who we were just speaking to a bit earlier, then, as this legislation is put into practice, is her experience in 1968 pretty much as it was in the early part of the 20th century, that people were, I mean, she was raped. A social worker, theoretically, who was supposed to help the victim, pressures her guardian to get her sterilized. A psychological evaluation takes place. She's found to have an above average IQ, and yet a board is convened. How does all this work then?
Look, by the 1960s, when this happened to Elaine, and Elaine and I have talked a lot about this over the years, it was a sham, and her case, unfortunately, is not that abnormal. I mean, it's not that unusual. This was going on in case after case. The social workers are bullying these people into these operations, and it's a monster hiding in plain sight. That they're putting out these cheery press releases. They're sterilizing their very story, this program. They're telling people, oh, we're saving these people from parenthood, they would say, stuff like that. Nobody knew just how aggressive the social workers were. And it starts off, I would argue, that yes, in the end, it's a form of genocide against African Americans. But in the beginning, it's all about socioeconomics, as so many things are in the American South.
But even in Elaine Riddick's case, it seems, when she was discovered to have an above-average IQ, her lack of means, the poverty that she was living in, was taken into account as a factor of her feeble-mindedness.
Sure, this program was always about two things going on. There was part of the national eugenics movement about improving bloodlines, and the other half was about saving the government money. There are conversations in our legislature on record back in the day where they're talking about that.
There was some resistance, clearly, because in 1927, the Buck versus Bell case reached the justices. The Supreme Court ruling actually was quoted at the Nuremberg trials by the Nazis, actually, in their defense, the ruling. It's never been expressly overturned, but the Supreme Court found in favor of eugenics, and this is a portion of Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes's finding, quote, "It's better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." Professor Lombardo, I mean, so the Supreme Court actually in some ways strengthened the hold of eugenics over the US as it continued. I mean, and that's the point. I mean, this practice did continue up until the 80s in Oregon, for example. I mean, it's astonishing.
Well, it's true that the Supreme Court decision really clarified the endorsement of eugenics in America. There was a fair amount of disagreement. People writing articles and letters to the editor and making speeches, people like Clarence Darrow and others condemning sterilization, and many scientists as well. But when the Supreme Court spoke, most of that opposition seemed to melt away, and programs were launched in the majority of American states. The last law was passed here in Georgia in 1937, and most of those states continued sterilizing people right up into the 1950s. The World War interrupted it. Most of the doctors were away serving, and so there was a change at that point. But as you have already said, places like North Carolina continued. The last sterilization record I was able to find in Virginia, where Carrie Buck was sterilized, was 1979.
Professor Stephen Selden, we mentioned the war there, and that's another part of this history that is perhaps willfully ignored, is how some of those in Germany in the 30s found some of the intellectual roots for their eugenics movement in the United States then.
They did indeed. And many of the leaders of American eugenics received awards and recommendations, commendations from their colleagues across the way who thought that the program in the United States was a model. It's interesting when we think about what we can do, what we can learn from that particular history moving forward. North Carolina has a wonderful opportunity to be a leader in terms of educating the children of North Carolina, in fact the children of the United States, about the history of the eugenics movement, and I think to speak to questions of human rights around that.
And we'll get to that in a second, but very quickly, Professor Lombardo there, if after the Second World War eugenics is declared a crime against humanity, how legally are North Carolina and other states in the US able to carry on with forced sterilization?
Well, eugenics was never declared a crime against humanity. The kind of things the Nazis were doing in the labor camps and in the concentration camps involved torture. It involved x-raying people until they died in some cases. It involved injecting them with strange chemicals. That was considered science, that is the defense that the Nazis used.
Right, but Nuremberg, I suppose, I mean, there was a finding against trying to stop the bloodline of a particular grouping, for example.
It's one definition of genocide.
Right.
That was, as you say, that was a definition of genocide, but there was no specific finding against eugenics in any broad sense. And in fact, no one said after the Second World War that any of the laws in America should be struck down. At the time, there were 28 or so that were still in place.
And in fact, actually, in 1945, one US representative proposed sterilizing Japanese Americans who were in internment camps. And I mean, that's the other point.
Those proposals were common.
Yeah, and in fact, there is evidence that in those internment camps, Japanese Americans were indeed sterilized. As we look back then on the history, I mean, do we have a proper record of how many people were sterilized, the age range? I mean, again, in North Carolina, a 10-year-old boy was castrated, actually. The racial makeup and so forth, yeah.
You're talking about a program that began, as you said, in 1907 and extends all the way up to 1980. So the conditions are different in different states and in different times. The people running the program, doing the operations, running the bureaucracy are different, and the quality of the records are different too. Some states have very clear records, other states have terrible records or have lost them altogether.
And on that issue of the racial figures there, I mean, Professor Selden, it's interesting because initially in the first part of the 20th century it was mainly whites and who were sterilized, but then there's a switch in the 60s, certainly in North Carolina, to African Americans.
Correct.
Yeah. I mean, what are we to make of that?
The definition of Nordic versus Mediterranean versus Eastern European were pretty close to racial categorizations even early on. So that again, the racial trope was very clear early in the beginning.
And in the 70s we have cases again, I mean, the Native American women, there was a sort of federal program almost to sterilize Native American
I mean, for those of us who study this, the surprise was that there were so few African Americans that we knew of early on, and that it became so clearly a focus upon African American women in North Carolina at the end.
Look, I call it the 3 Ps, at least in North Carolina. At the beginning, it's progressives, then it goes to paternalism, then it's rank prejudice at the end.
Now, to start, Patricia, I'm going to guess that most of our viewers likely know about the 6 million Jewish people killed during the Holocaust. But can you please tell us about the Nazis' first victims of mass murder, German children with disabilities, including many so-called Aryan children?
Yes, and this is part of the Nazis' first program of mass murder, as you said, the so-called euthanasia program, which targeted institutionalized patients with disabilities. It predated the more systematic mass murder of Jews that we know as the Holocaust by about 2 years, and the first victims of euthanasia were children. In August of 1939, about 2 weeks before World War II broke out in Europe, the Reich Interior Ministry ordered doctors and midwives to report infants and toddlers under the age of 3 who had severe mental or physical disabilities. And a few months later, that October, parents of children with disabilities were encouraged to bring their children to special pediatric clinics throughout Germany. In reality, these were children's killing wards, where children were murdered with overdoses of medication and sometimes to starvation. About 10,000 physically and mentally disabled children, German children, were murdered as a result of this child euthanasia program during the war years. Now, we usually associate mass murder programs in Nazi Germany with the SS, but in this killing program, this was carried out by doctors and nurses.
And people may wonder why. I mean, it's hard to make sense of any of the killings from this era, but let's talk about the ideology behind this disturbing program. How did the Nazis frame people with physical and mental disabilities as somehow a threat or a danger to society?
Right. So a lot of Nazi policies that involved the German medical community came from eugenics. That was a popular scientific movement of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And today, eugenics has been soundly discredited, but we have to remember that in its day, it was seen as cutting edge science by scientists in many countries, including here in the United States. And eugenicists believed that society's ills, criminality, mental illness, alcoholism, even poverty, were hereditary. That is, nature, not nurture, made you the kind of person you were. And it's really the idea of selective breeding. If you can breed a better dog or a better horse, as human beings have done for millennia, centuries, you can breed a better person and a better national body. And here you see someone undergoing a eugenic examination. The Nazis took eugenic ideas to a really deadly extreme with the idea of restoring the racial integrity of Germany. And they believed that people with disabilities were not only threats to the Nazi state, but that they were unworthy of life.
And that they were a drain on society, right? A financial drain, a burden, a biological blemish, if you will.
Exactly, Edna. Exactly.
For viewers who are interested, we invite you to learn more about eugenics and how its pseudoscientific theories shape Nazi policies by looking in the comments section. We'll be posting links to our online Holocaust encyclopedia where you can delve deeper into the subject. To turn back to our subject at hand, though, Patricia, we're going to actually show, talking about this way that people with disabilities were portrayed and dehumanized in Nazi society. Let's show some disturbing and dehumanizing propaganda that the Nazis created in order to rationalize a sterilization program that targeted people with disabilities. This is very upsetting footage to watch. I'll just caution our viewers, but let's have a look.
Irrtum ist, dass sich solche Kranken glücklich fühlen und am Leben hängen. Sie haben überhaupt kein Daseinsbewusstsein. Sie hängen nur infolge ihrer totalen Kritiklosigkeit an den Gewohnheiten ihres Zustands. Jede medizinische Behandlung oder auch nur Beeinflussung ist hier ausgeschlossen. Was soll aus diesen unschuldigen Opfern werden?
Now, it's important to note that when the narrator uses the term victims, he means that the individuals we see are victims of their condition. Patricia, could you please just explain some of what we saw, what it was intended to accomplish or communicate?
Yes, these kind of films were usually shown as trailers for feature films. And this is propaganda, which was created for the sterilization program, which began in 1934. Under the Nazi regime and sterilized about 400,000 Germans. And the Nazi propagandists cherry-picked very specific images to exhibit the worst cases of physical and mental disabilities in an effort to dehumanize these individuals. This very radical sterilization program paved the way for the murder of people with disabilities.
Now, we'd begun by talking about the murder of children with disabilities, but children did not remain the only targets of this program. Please explain about that.
You're completely right. And Nazi planners very quickly moved to extend the program to adults already living in institutional settings. And there is a villa in the central Berlin, which was really the nerve center for this secret program. And its street address, Tiergartenstrasse 4, gave the operation its code name, Operation T4. And by the end of the war, 250,000 people with disabilities living in institutions were murdered by the Nazi regime.
Were the methods of murdering these people used to test out ways to murder the Jews later?
That's a really interesting question. And yes, that's absolutely true. This, as I said, first mass killing program of the Nazis, the gassing technology developed for this program is later embroidered upon to murder Jews. And the T4 program for adults used at this particular point, bottled chemically produced carbon monoxide gas to kill its victims. And the planners of the final solution expand on this technology using carbon monoxide gas generated from motor engine exhaust to create first the mobile gas van used to kill Jews and other victims in the killing fields of the German-occupied Soviet Union. And then in stationary gas chambers at Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Those are 3 killing centers that murdered 1.7 million Jews in German-occupied Poland. And the staff of these 3 camps, who had learned to murder innocent and vulnerable victims in the so-called euthanasia program, are deployed there as the main German personnel at these 3 killing centers. So there's this link between the mass murder programs. It's very significant.
And it's a link that's both in technology, but also in personnel, that it's a sort of testing ground for methods of killing and a proving ground for people who are willing and able and compliant to carry out this kind of mass murder.
As governments and states across the world continue to battle the COVID-19 pandemic, a deeply disturbing question. Has there been a shameful failure to protect some of the world's most vulnerable citizens? People with disabilities, 1 billion of the world's population.
It felt like we as disabled people were just invisible from the story.
We've been investigating allegations that people may have been denied potentially life-saving treatments simply because they're disabled.
You know, it's almost a eugenic decision. It's somehow saying that other people's right to life is more important than ours.
And examining claims that the COVID-related mortality rate amongst people with disabilities is shockingly and disproportionately high.
The majority of people that have died during the pandemic have been persons with disabilities or persons with chronic diseases. It is outrageous.
As the pandemic spread throughout 2020, we set off with careful precautions on a journey across Europe to investigate the dangers faced by disabled people. Dangers highlighted by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in an exclusive interview.
We know that people living with disabilities, usually they had already unequal conditions and they are discriminated, and that makes them more likely to be exposed to the virus and less likely to be treated. As you know, in many countries, the biggest amount of people who have died of COVID-19 is people living with disabilities.
Michelle Bachelet was not alone in her concerns. Across the world, disabled people and their supporters were trying to raise the alarm. In April 2020, 4 leading international NGOs wrote to the World Health Organization asking them urgently to collect accurate data on just how many people with disabilities were dying of COVID. In October 2020, I spoke to Dr. Larkos Sietha of the WHO. What data has the WHO collected about the numbers of disabled people infected by COVID and the numbers of deaths of people with disabilities due to COVID?
Yeah, this data is not available to us at this point.
Why not? Why not?
Because it is not reported, but it is also because it is not collected. We would welcome very much if countries come forward and provide this data.
The World Health Organization later said that after reviewing sources from around 30 countries, they were confident in claiming that
people with disabilities constitute a very large proportion of COVID-related deaths.
So what was happening outside the UK? Despairing of the failure by international authorities and governments to gather accurate data, the NGOs who'd asked the WHO to gather information set up their own global survey. It was a hugely ambitious study, spread across 134 countries in 25 languages and incorporating over 3,000 testimonies, the majority from disabled people and their organisations. The findings were devastating. Across the world, an
egregious failure to protect the lives of people in residential institutions, a dramatic breakdown in essential services in the community,
and that,
in some cases, persons with disabilities were directly denied access to treatment for COVID-19 because of their disability.
Stephen Allen's NGO Validity helped set up the global report.
It confirmed one of our big fears, which is that the human rights of people with disabilities were not being, in fact, directly addressed or prioritised in the response to the pandemic. I think it is a serious neglect by states towards some of their citizens who have the greatest vulnerability.
These findings suggested that far from getting the extra support they needed, many disabled people were actually getting less support than they'd had before the pandemic. As the world began to wake up to the threat to elderly people in care homes, the disabled in some institutions across Europe were being abandoned.
We have more than 1 million of Europeans with disabilities living in institutions. So institutions are the places that people become forgotten, neglected.
Disability activists were furious with the suggestion that people with stable long-term conditions like learning disabilities, autism and cerebral palsy might be scored too frail to get life-saving treatment. Doug Pawley, who lives in a home in Wetherby in the UK, has a neurological condition which limits his hearing and mobility.
I found the NICE guidelines incredibly offensive, but also utterly unsurprising. We have a wide history of disabled people's rights being considered a luxury at best.
The World Health Organization said they'd received international reports of disabled people being denied healthcare because of triaging policies. They said that although they'd produced an ethical framework for such decisions, they had not collected triage data country by country. Back in the UK, the advice from NICE confirmed the worst fears of many disabled people.
This was at the time when a lot of us thought we might end up in hospital, and it left people feeling very uncomfortable and unsafe.
In response to vocal objections, NICE amended their guidance, saying the system shouldn't be used to assess certain groups, including those with learning disabilities or stable long-term disabilities such as cerebral palsy. Across the globe, there are now growing demands that disabled people's voices are heard when vaccine programs are rolled out.
No one is going to be safe unless we're all safe. When there is a vaccine, it needs to be a universal public good. Everybody has to have access. And of course, people living with disabilities, of course, they need to have access.
But internationally, there are few signs that the disabled are getting adequate access. The European Union's vaccination strategy, adopted in October 2020, made no mention of persons with disabilities. And one international NGO told us that in many countries, people with disabilities risked not getting access to vaccinations at all.
Almost 80% of persons with disabilities live in poverty, live in poor countries. This means that if the vaccination is not going to be distributed in an equitable way and doesn't reach the poor group, persons with disabilities are also going to be excluded. So our major fear is that the vaccination does not reach persons with disabilities on time, and we keep losing lives and livelihood. Persons with disabilities and their representative organizations are not being consulted. If we really want to change this and break this vicious cycle of exclusion and discrimination, we should invite persons with disabilities in the decision-making process.
But far from having their voices heard, the evidence suggests many disabled people are being left increasingly isolated.
The strict quarantine measures that were put in place increased the risk for children with severe disabilities who had pre-existing conditions. They were also exposed to higher risks of abuse and neglect and exploitation during the lockdown.
And according to NGOs who organised a global international survey into the effects of the pandemic on disabled people, lockdowns have left many across the world in institutions without minimal protections.
When you don't have eyes watching, the most terrible abuses will take place guaranteed behind those closed doors. And ombudsmen have not been able to operate, independent human rights monitors have not been able to visit, so suddenly the curtain has come down on institutions.
There were many types of abuse that were alleged by the respondents to this survey worldwide. One of them was about very strict enforcement of lockdowns by police, sometimes military and other security forces, in some cases resulting in extremely serious incidents and even the death of people with disabilities who either could not hear or were unable to understand instructions or were unable to show that they were cooperating with these very strict rules. But there were many other types of abuse and violence as well. There was an uptick in violence against women and girls with disabilities who found that they had nowhere they could go, essentially being locked down, sometimes in abusive situations.
The COVID pandemic has traumatised the world, a truly seismic event which has left few untouched. But while much of the developed world cautiously celebrates the beginning of hope that the virus may be vanquished, for many disabled people, the future looks far bleaker.
Let's look at the changes and the challenges with a pair of activists from two different generations. Judy Heumann is a lifelong civil rights activist. She sued the New York City Board of Education to become that city's first teacher to use a wheelchair. She's led numerous protests to force institutions and public buildings to become more accessible. And she served as a special advisor on disability rights for the U.S. State Department. And Carrie Gray helped organize people with disabilities in a protest just last month in front of the White House as part of Black Disabled Lives Matter. She is with the American Association of People with Disabilities. And we welcome both of you to the NewsHour. Judy Heumann, this has been a cause for you going back to your days as a teenager. What does this particular anniversary mean for you when you think about the contributions of the ADA?
I think the Americans with Disabilities Act is an amazingly important piece of legislation. It has allowed us as disabled people to see that our coalition work over the decades before 1990 resulted in an acknowledgement on the part of the Congress that discrimination was pervasive across the United States and that it needed to intervene to grant us our rights. That being said, like many of the previous speakers have said, granting rights and really being able to be accepted by society is something that we're still striving for. And I think when we look at the fact that the built environment, including interpreters and captioning and other types of accommodations other than employment, we've made really great progress. But when we look at the data in the area of employment, I think that really speaks an amazing amount about how much further we have to go. And those figures are pre-COVID.
And Carrie Gray, you were born the year the ADA was signed. You've grown up under this law. What has it meant to you?
The ADA has meant a lot of different things. I think that one of the first things I think about is the ADA and what it has done for inclusion and perception. So we know that 1 in 5 people across the United States have a disability, but it's still not widely known that disability is not just the summation of your medical conditions, but is a legal term that gives you access to your human rights. So I mention that because disability is often used as a description that defines people's relationship to their physical and mental health, and often hospitals and things of that nature Most people don't get excited or feel empowered about having to constantly access their health. And there's a lot of people with disabilities that have rough stories around all of the questions that people can have around, like, how much can this person do and contribute to society? So I think for me, one of the first things that I think about outside of the specifics of the ADA is just how it ensures that we're defining disability as a legal term that grants people access to human rights. So I'm excited about what is done and how much more we're going to do moving forward.
Picking up on that, Judy, when you said you said there's a difference. It's one thing to be granted the rights. It's another thing to be truly accepted. So pick up on that.
So one of the positive parts of the ADA is the growing strength of the disability rights movement. The depth of the movement, the racial diversity of the movement that's coming forward, the sexual orientation, religion, on and on. People are more able to come forward and be their full selves, including having disability as a central part of who we are, and not looking at disability as a negative. I think more and more people are looking at disability as a natural, normal part of life and something that we do not want to be seen as a medical condition, but rather as part of the civil rights movement, fighting not just for the rights of disabled people, but for the rights of all people who are marginalized.
And Carrie Gray, those are exactly the kinds of things I hear when I talk to people with disabilities of all ages, and especially the younger generation. When you think about priorities during your lifetime, what are they? What do you most want to see change?
I think there's two areas that I'm thinking of in particular. One, employment is so important to, people across our country. We're having to figure out, how do we survive? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we thrive even as people with disabilities, and also people with disabilities who have other existing identities such as race and gender and so many different things. And so employment becomes a question and a situation that all of us have to explore. I think that we've seen that the ADA has given us a lot of access to make sure that we can defend ourselves when situations of discrimination do occur.
I think it's everyone. Everyone has a stake in this. The entities that are not allowed to discriminate need to understand not only what discrimination is, they need to understand what the remedies are. And I think in many cases, and COVID is a great example, people being denied the right to work at home who have disabilities or didn't have disabilities, and how we were able to really quickly convert over to virtual. Now, I'm not saying disabled people should only work virtually at all, but I am saying that when a crisis occurred, people were able to do things that they said they couldn't do before. I believe it's very important for the leadership of business to make sure that their human resource people understand what their obligations are, that their staff are trained. I also think it's very important that the general citizen in the United States recognize the fact that disability is something that we can acquire at any point in our life. And it's not a threatening comment, it's a reality comment. And so in part, what we're saying is, learn from us, work with us, help us move forward in our lives, and help you prepare for your future life or other loved ones in your family.
And Carrie, I am curious to know where you see the responsibility lies from making these changes that need to be made.
I absolutely agree with Judy. Everyone has to do their part to ensure that we not only have this piece of legislation, but that it is being enforced throughout everyone's entities. And so as an individual, we have to get to the point where we are documenting our experiences and we're speaking out against any situation that can be harmful to us as individuals and our community. The company has to make sure that they understand what their role is in this and how they can be creating environments that are inclusive of all people, including people with disabilities. So I think when all of us play our role, government, company, the individual, we are actually getting towards that journey and success of full disability rights.
We have a long way to go.
Well, it's something for all of us to think about on this 30th anniversary of the ADA. I do hope all Americans spend some time thinking about their responsibility. Judy Heumann, Carrie Gray, thank you both.
Thank you.
We often hear about and cover the struggles that many Americans face when they try to land a good job. If you have a disability, the challenge of getting hired or even getting a response to an inquiry, much less a face-to-face interview, is significantly harder. Our economics correspondent Paul Solman explores why that is still happening. It's part of his weekly series, Making Sense.
Good evening. My name is Ami Profeta.
Ami Profeta has cerebral palsy. He's been looking for work for over a year.
People have hung up the phone. They don't respond to my emails.
Profeta's job hunt may be more challenging than most. The unemployment rate for those with a disability is more than double the rate for those without. We interviewed economist Douglas Cruz, himself a paraplegic, via Skype.
It's not just a matter of people with disabilities staying at home and collecting disability income. It's a matter of people who want to work, are not as easily able to find work.
In a 2015 study, Cruz's research team submitted 6,000 fake online job applications for accounting positions. 1/3 said the applicant had a spinal cord injury, another third Asperger's syndrome, and 1/3 did not mention a disability at all. The results?
People with disabilities were 26% less likely to get expressions of employer interest.
What's going on, do you suppose?
There's a lot of discomfort with people with disabilities. I think apart from that, there's a lot of uncertainty. Oh, geez, someone in a spinal cord injury, I'm not sure they're going to fit in here.
They refer to it as fear of the unknown.
Mason Ameri co-authored the study.
How do I know if this person can do the job? How do I know the cost? So all of these unknowns ultimately compel an employer to express no hiring intent.
Even though the Americans with Disabilities Act bars such discrimination for firms with more than 15 employees. Nicole Ellis returned to the job market after the bank she worked at went bust. But she decided to leave off her resume the fact that she's legally blind due to ocular albinism.
I didn't think that I would be able to get my foot in the door.
It still took 3.5 years to land a job, here at Liberty Resources, a Philadelphia nonprofit which promotes independent living for the disabled.
I would get the calls back, I would go on the interviews, and once you start discussing, because I have to let them know that I'm going to need these accommodations, like software that enlarges font, or enhances speech recognition. So once you start talking about those things, it kind of becomes like dead silence almost.
Really? You can feel it?
You can feel it. And then they'll give you some other scenarios as far as, well, what about, let's say if it snows, are you going to be able to get into work?
But you can understand, or can you not understand, why an employer would be concerned about all those sorts of things?
I do understand, but on the other hand, I've worked around people who do not have disabilities, who do not come to work and who do not work. So, I mean, to me, I understand the doubt and the question, but you are discriminating just based on the what ifs of someone's disability.
Liam Doherty has a master's in public administration from the University of Pennsylvania and ataxia, a condition marked by a lack of muscle coordination.
The way that disability affects employment is more insidious, more subtle, more insidious. My resume has all these gaps in there. And so I think an employer looks at that and they see, why has this guy not been working?
So the gaps in your work history and the kinds of work you haven't done are kind of signals, you think?
Definitely.
Doherty, like Ellis, also found work here at Liberty. Bill Krebs says employers have always underestimated him because of his intellectual disability.
At one time, it was the R word. We got rid of the R word. It means mentally retarded. So I was labeled with a mental retardation. My IQ is mild, so I was IQ of 70. When you're labeled with a disability, it's like Hitler did to the Jews. They put a tattoo on your arm, and that stigma stays for the rest of your life.
So once you're stigmatized, then
that's it.
You're out of the game.
You're out of the game, no matter how hard you try.
Until he too found a niche at Liberty where disability is a commonplace. But what prompted this story is a second and more surprising finding of the crew's Emery research. Early results show that when they sent applications just for jobs in data entry and software development,
So we found no evidence of discrimination.
None.
None, at least not with the preliminary data.
And why might that be? We went looking for a case study in the real world and found one in Philadelphia at an accounting firm.
We make a concerted effort now. We're going to universities, speaking to the people responsible for their students with disabilities.
Steve Howe is managing partner for EY Americas, formerly Ernst & Young.
The goal is that certification.
In a pilot program, it's pushing to hire more people with autism, a group that has had up until now an estimated and underemployment rate of between 70 and 90%. But, says Sam Briefer,
we all bring something to the table that a lot of people cannot. We are very detail-oriented. We analyze things in a very specific way.
Briefer is one of 4 recent hires here with autism spectrum disorder.
There are others that are very more detail-oriented than I am, and are much better with numbers.
Well, it's an accounting firm, I guess. Being good with numbers is probably a good thing.
It is. So it puts us all at a huge advantage.
But of course, people on the spectrum typically have trouble socializing, communicating, an obvious handicap. Were you nervous about taking the job?
I was, yes. I first thought that I would be communicating with a lot of people at once, which is something that I always get stressed about. But knowing that I work independently a lot makes me feel a lot better with where I work.
When things do get stressful, EY brings in a job coach to help. The team's regular manager, Jamel Mitchell, got neurodiversity training ahead of time, but he's also learning on the job.
They're very specific and very clear, as opposed to possibly a neurotypical person that may try to slide in at 9:10. The folks that are on the spectrum will say, hey, I arrived at 9:02 today. Do I need to work until 6:02 today?
And your reaction to that?
Don't worry about the 2 minutes, we're okay.
A lot of people on the spectrum tend to be, or at least initially, more rigid in some of their thinking.
But, says program participant Stan Huang, this form of rigidity has a major upside.
It also tends to make them want to be more honest, I think. What would be the point of like lying about something or being deceptive?
Because you're more naturally just straightforward.
Yes.
Managing partner Howe recently gave the team behind the pilot program a Better Begins With You award.
Well, thank you all very much.
But look, this isn't about feel-good inclusivity so much as boosting the bottom line. Howe hopes to leverage the special abilities he's seen in his workers with autism.
We've learned from technology companies like SAP, Microsoft, HP, who have hired people with these kind of skills. We think it's a rich talent pool, and we're going to expand this now from this exercise in Philadelphia to 3 or 4 other cities in the next year and scale this up.
And that means more job prospects for people on the spectrum, like Stan Wang.
No matter what kind of functionality a person may be, everyone wants to be treated like a human being. Everybody deserves an opportunity.
And at long last, in certain jobs, they're getting one. But for those with disabilities who don't seem to provide a profit advantage, many still seem to be on their own.
Employers do not respond.
This is economics correspondent Paul Salman reporting from Philadelphia.
A wonderful report. And one more note, Paul's team reached out to several major groups representing employers, large and small, to hear their take. Some did not respond. Others said that they will start to consider ways of tackling this problem.
According to the medical model of disability, the word disabled means less able. Less able to achieve your potential, less able to have meaningful relationships, less able to play an active part in the world around you, and that this is just your bad luck. This outdated view of the world puts the responsibility of overcoming disabling barriers on the person with an impairment. But this idea is changing. The more modern social model of disability says that a person doesn't have a disability, but that they are disabled. They are disabled by society. It is the attitudes and physical barriers imposed on them by society that prevents them from achieving their potential. The social model was developed by disabled people and their allies to help them take action against discrimination and to empower people to find solutions, remove barriers, and campaign together for equality and human rights. They showed how people with lots of different impairments face many of the same problems. These disabling barriers include prejudiced opinions and attitudes, restricted access, and people being systematically excluded. The social model looks for the ways that society can be planned and organised in order to provide accessibility, independence, and opportunity in a way that enables people rather than disables them. What we learn from the social model of disability is that disability is a social construct created by social barriers, barriers which can be eliminated. We learn that it is the responsibility of government, public spaces, businesses, and individual people to make the changes, to increase the access, and build a more equal society, where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Over 1 billion people worldwide have a disability. That's more than 15% of the world's population. Most live in developing countries. This number is expected to grow due to factors such as conflict, aging, stunting, and natural disasters. Persons with disabilities face higher rates of poverty compared with others. They encounter biases and barriers when accessing basic services. When they're excluded, it's harder to escape the cycle of poverty and marginalization. That's why disability inclusive development plays an important role in the World Bank's goals of ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. How do we break down barriers and ensure no one is left behind? By enabling Imani to go to school, providing her teacher with the tools necessary to meet her needs, and giving her family access to support services and assistive devices. By helping Lee understand a high-risk situation in the event of an emergency, and fostering a work environment that gives him a reasonable accommodation through visual signage and other devices. When persons with disabilities are included in everyday activities, they can and do participate and contribute to society. Join us in building inclusive, resilient, and sustainable communities for all. Let's start here and learn more. Download the framework from our resource platform.
In the 1980s, a designer by the name of Sam Farber
noticed that his wife Betsy was having a difficult time peeling apples while she was making an apple tart. Betsy had mild osteoarthritis and was having a difficult time gripping her hand around the vegetable peeler. Inspired by his wife's challenges, Sam designed a whole new set of kitchen tools to meet her needs. The kitchen tools he designed turned into the OXO Good Grip brand, which is immensely successful among people with and without osteoarthritis. Sam Farber's story really illustrates a design philosophy called universal design. Universal design is about designing products and environments that are usable by the widest possible spectrum of users, without the need for adaptation or specialized design. By becoming familiar with the principles of universal design, you'll be better positioned to design age-friendly workplaces. The first principle is equitable use. The automatic doors at grocery stores are equally usable for people in wheelchairs, people pushing shopping carts, and people with hands full of groceries. The second principle has to do with flexibility in use. The scissors illustrated here are usable both for people who are right-handed and for people who are left-handed. The third principle of universal design is that the design should be simple and intuitive to use. Public emergency stations are towers that are brightly colored and only have one big button to push, so that even kids can operate them. Universal designs also have information that is perceptible. Small bumps on cell phones and on keyboards tell people's hands, in addition to their eyes, which buttons to push. Universally designed products also have a built-in tolerance for error. This particular nail gun is designed to release a nail only when the safety tip is depressed. The undo button on your computer is another good example of a universal design that's tolerant of error. Universal designs also require a low level of physical effort. So this door lever doesn't require the same sort of grip strength to operate as a typical doorknob, and it could even be operated by a closed fist or an elbow if your hands are full. The seventh and final principle of universal design is allowing enough size and space to approach and use the object or the environment. Wide gates at subway stations are good for people in wheelchairs as well as good for people with luggage. Those are the 7 principles of universal design. People who follow these principles as they design products, environments, and services are going to be able to reach a broader range of users, a full spectrum of users, much in the way Sam Farber's kitchen tools are better for people with and without osteoarthritis.
We live in a world built for people who hear.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Live from NPR.
But what would our man-made world look like and feel like if it were designed for those who don't hear? Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. is a school for the deaf and hard of hearing, and they are redesigning entire buildings based on the sensory experience of those who don't hear.
We've only just begun, though, to challenge ourselves to examine how we could design entire buildings, entire campuses, or even cities to be aligned with deaf space. Deaf people as a culture have been marginalized largely. We've been, as a marginalized community, developing our own culture, and that defines what kind of place we call home, how we claim and occupy space. And so we've begun to ask ourselves these questions, and because of that, gotten a lot more creative, begun to think bigger about how we can find different ways to align our ways of being to our environment. The classrooms are oriented in a semicircle or a U shape, so that classmates can continually visually connect with other classmates. So if you want to be involved in a discussion, everybody has a front row seat to seeing. In a wider hallway, 2 people can walk in parallel signing with each other, but we do have specific distance parameters wherein we can observe the whole body in its signing. Hearing people, though, could disregard that kind of a distance requirement. They can be just next to each other, speaking to each other without that need for the visual field. Stairs also require a great deal more visual attention to your footing. And so ramps reduce that. So if you're communicating with somebody while you're navigating a ramp, you can do so much more easily. Within deaf space, we have always relied on, a heavily visible environment because we're not getting information auditorily. So if you're sitting at the top of the terrace, you can see all the way to the bottom of the terrace. It's one distinct place that can be unified or have three distinct areas. Color and lighting are highly aligned to communication access. Blues and greens will usually contrast with most skin tones enough to reduce eye strain. You may want to have more diffused lighting. A lot of the lighting here is directional so that it can be aligned. But there are mirrors present to allow somebody to know and have a sense of what's happening behind them. Through the use of that reflection, they can know if somebody is nearing them behind them, or if somebody taps them, they look up and that reflective space lets them know who's there. Transparency of, say, doorways, so that when a person is in an office, they can either have a transparent doorway or passageway, or one that's opaque, so that I can see lighting and shadow and movement, know that somebody's at the door, but not clearly see who's there. Very often, people refer to hearing loss as an example, which negatively frames the whole approach from the outset. But let's imagine the deaf baby who has never heard, and yet is still described as experiencing hearing loss. And instead, we propose a different framing, that of deaf gain. What is it that we gain by the experience of being or becoming deaf? Deaf space, I believe, is born of the idea that we have something to offer the world, that being deaf confers some very interesting perspectives on life.
The Centre for Excellence Universal Design is part of the National Disability Authority, which is based in Dublin, Ireland. The three areas the centre covers are standards, education and awareness.
The Centre for Excellence in Universal Design is the only statutory authority of its kind anywhere in the world. I think it's a testimony to Ireland that they have invested in building this capability.
The centre was set up under legislation in 2007. Its key aims is how do we create societies, our communities, that are fully accessible, understandable and easy to use by all citizens.
Design is for everyone. It's a fundamental expectation that people have that the buildings they occupy, the technology they use, the products and services they've access to can work for them without needing special modifications or without making them feel that in some way they're inadequate because the design doesn't work for them.
The Universal Design Principles is a set of 7 design principles that are essentially design goals that are intended to inspire design thinking that helps to ensure that the output of the design process is going to be accessible and usable by all people.
The thing that amazes me very often about asking students to design in universal design context is how much it improves their design, but also how much it makes them aware that there are other people around.
We've had categories for universal design excellence in the design awards for many years now, and it's often you'll find that the ones that win that category end up being the overall winner of the entire show. So that really, I think, speaks volumes about how much the principles kind of underwrite good design.
Enterprise Ireland is proud to work with the universities in the Universal Design Grand Challenge, whereby designers across the country submit their universal design ideas for improved living, not just for people with disabilities, but for everybody. It's a fabulous resource for Enterprise Ireland because it provides not only the impetus for new design ideas, but it's an excellent testing ground for new companies coming through with ideas for universal design.
We would introduce universal design in any project, so we would also do domestic work from kind of adaptations to very, very large new housing, and most clients come to you and they're just thinking about today. But to successfully design, you need to think about the long term, because in 5 years' time that's going to have changed. They now have teenagers or children that are in college or working but still living at home. Then they're getting older, they might become less able, less mobile, all of these things. So you need to start to think about the long term in any housing design or in any domestic work.
ICT is one of the areas where universal design is most applicable and most visible. If we consider the technology that we use every day, such as mobile devices, these are really good examples of universal design.
IT professionals need to be sure that they continue to develop their competence in universal design, and there are many drivers for this that they'll come across in their professional careers. There's definitely a market need and a demand.
So we work very closely with standards bodies at national level, such as the National Standards Authority of Ireland, and at European level.
Working with the Centre for Excellence in Universal Design creates an environment where we can set out requirements for all our citizens so that they can access, understand and use tourism services and utility services in their daily lives.
A lot of the work that we do in the centre is the development of design guidance. How do you get designers and built environment professionals to change? And from that we develop workshops where we invite along the end users, such as people from professional built environment bodies and people from our stakeholder groups. You could have a landscape architect talking with an engineer, talking with someone who may be a wheelchair user, talking to someone whose child may have autism.
I think building for everyone, the box of books that the Centre for Universal Design released is excellent, and it should be in every architecture office.
Universal design as a concept, when it was developed, was, I suppose the concept is primarily applicable to the construction and primarily, you know, say houses or buildings and making them suitable for everybody. I think it is spread out from that. That's been very welcome. We've seen, particularly through the awards every year, you can see where students are taking that methodology or concept and moving it into medical devices or software and other products.
Literally, somebody in City Architects can pick up the phone to somebody in the centre and have a chat about an issue. They'll give us an honest response, and it helps us make our projects better. If we're not designing our buildings and places for everybody, who are we designing them for? We're designing them for nobody.
I can't think of any area where the principles that underpin universal design aren't appropriate and couldn't be applied. Because really what universal design asks us to do is to have an emotional response to the needs of our learners, to the needs of our users. Now's the time to grasp universal design in partnership with the champions for universal design, the Centre of Excellence in Universal Design, and employ it from day one in all that we do.
We need more resources to actually progress universal design. We need to build capacity with engineers, and when we talk about commitment, we talk about bringing some passion to this whole area of universal design, which at its core is about equality.
Hello. Today I want to talk about hashtag disability too white, a hashtag by Vilisa Thompson on Twitter in order to bring attention to the lack of racial diversity in disability representation. So first, let's start off with, think fast. How many disabled characters can you name in film and television? Okay, how many of those characters are people of color? Right. For many, even trying to come up with disabled characters in the first place can be incredibly difficult. And though many of the ones that I can think of, I wouldn't necessarily call good or accurate representation, but that's another topic for another video. And they're certainly not racially diverse, but they do exist. So if you're stuck for some examples, I think it can help you out there. Here are some movies and TV shows that feature disabled characters. The Miracle Worker, Sybil, Rain Man, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter, The Piano, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, What's Eating Gilbert Grape, Forrest Gump, Swing Kids, Girl Interrupted, I Know Sam, The L Word, The Other Sister, Adam, Grey's Anatomy, Cast-Offs, Nip Tuck, Pretty Little Liars, Switched at Birth, Avatar, Family Guy, House MD, Soul Surfer, Glee, Temple Grandin, The King's Speech, The Theory of Everything, Mad Max Fury Road, Hush, Me Before You, The Fundamentals of Caring, Who's Driving Doug, don't breathe. And I could probably go on, but we don't want to take up this whole video with just that one point. But Annie, some of those are real people. They can't just... I realize that. But there are real people of color with disabilities. It's just that their stories are the ones not being told. And sure, absolutely, you could definitely name some people of color with disabilities in media if you tried. But I promise you, it's gonna be nowhere near as long as the list of disabled white characters. Hashtag disability2white does not intend to erase the struggles and the ableism that disabled white people experience. It is merely addressing the issue that the intersection of race and disability is not often addressed and not often represented. How the intersection of being disabled and a person of color often means heightened risk of danger and discrimination. How the erasure has people in disbelief of a person of color actually being disabled because they've never seen it before. How prejudice against race can make it difficult or even impossible to be given access to appropriate medical care or to be taken seriously in those spaces. When our history books erase us, when the news erases us. Even when this year, a group home for people with disabilities was attacked. 19 of them were murdered and 45 left wounded, all between the ages of 18 and 70. Because of someone's hatred for people with disabilities. A time when non-disabled people had the opportunity to show their support for the disability community, just as they had for the LGBT community when Pulse was attacked the month before. But instead there was silence. Another opportunity to show support for the disability community would be to stick around after the Olympics for the Paralympics. But not many people do that either. Not many people are even aware that it's happening. That kind of erasure is incredibly painful. It sends a message that our lives are not as valuable as non-disabled lives. Hashtag disability2white is a conversation that highlights how, as minuscule as disability representation is already, disabled POC, among several other identities, among disabled women and disabled LGBT folks, etc., their representation is microscopic. Media representation has a significant impact on how society views us. That visibility allows non-disabled people to get to know us and the discriminations we face to this very moment by inviting us into their living rooms through their television sets. This is how people will get to know us and care about us, what happens to us, what we're doing, our equality and access, be outraged when we are murdered.
Intersectionality. Have you heard this word before? Even if you have, you might not know what it means. Let's take a look at it. The first part's easy enough. Intersection, a place where things come together. Intersectionality refers to the reality that we all have multiple identities that intersect to make us who we are. It also gives us a way to talk about oppressions and privileges that overlap and reinforce each other. This term dates back to the 1980s and legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw. She noticed that we didn't have an effective way to talk about how the experiences of Black women are different from the experiences of Black men and of white women. How? Black women endure both gender discrimination and racial discrimination. Over the last 30 years, scholars, educators, and activists have expanded the use of the word intersectionality to talk about identities beyond race and gender. Let's look at a few examples. Jerry has a disability, and his family lives below the poverty line. He is the oldest of 10, which requires him to do a lot of caregiving, and sometimes keeps him out of school. No one in the school counseling office has talked to Jerry or his parents about his plans for after graduation. He has applied for several jobs, but never gets called back. Fatima is Muslim and recently came to the United States from Somalia. She finds that many people at her school make assumptions about her values and abilities before they speak to her. Many of her classmates think she shouldn't be at their school at all. Greta comes from an affluent family. Both her parents and grandparents went to college, and her father owns a successful business. She doesn't think about her identity very often, but she does think of herself as someone who will go to college and get a good job once she graduates. Think about Greta's situation as opposed to Fatima's or Jerry's. Fatima and Jerry are members of marginalized groups. They don't get to choose whether or not to think about their identities. Greta, on the other hand, can ignore intersectionality if she wants to. Life isn't the same for everyone, even for people who share identity characteristics. By adopting an intersectional lens, we have a better opportunity to understand why and to change the institutions that help and harm us based on who we are.